I woke up in a prison cart rolling across a barren wasteland. Cold wind cut through my thin, noble clothes as the soldiers stopped and unlocked my cage. Their captain, a knight named Roya, tossed a leather pouch on the ground and told me this was my new territory. He said the king and my uncle were being merciful. What a joke. My name is Regg Golden Wheat, or it was. I came to this world from Earth 18 years ago and grew up as the eldest son of a powerful marquis. My father was a sky knight who protected the northern border for a decade. But everything fell apart at my coming-of-age ceremony a week ago. See, in this world, when night falls, terrible monsters called the Eerie crawl out of the darkness and devour everything alive. The only protection is something called the Lord's Fire, a magical flame that keeps the monsters away. Nobles control these fires, and that's what gives them their power. The new young king forced my father to lead an army against a neighboring kingdom. Then one night, the noble territory where the army was camped just vanished. The king immediately declared my father a traitor, saying he intentionally let his lord's fire die out and got 10,000 elite soldiers killed. They stripped me of my family name, my inheritance, and banished me here, the Sea Wind Plains, the most desolate corner of the kingdom. My uncle took everything, the title, the lands, all of it. The only reason I'm still alive is because my mother came from the eagle-eyed ducal family in another kingdom. They were afraid my grandfather might retaliate if they kill me outright. So instead they sent me somewhere I'd die on my own. I looked around. No people, no buildings, no food, no trade routes. Just cracked dry earth and wind. The knight and his soldiers rode off fast. They needed to reach safety before dark too. I clenched my fists and swore an oath. Every bit of suffering they put on me, I will repay 1,000 times over. Then I opened the pouch. Inside was a Lord's Fire seed, a small red amber with a flame flickering inside, and 5 low-grade Eerie crystals. 3 crystals just to light the fire, leaving me only 2. Not even enough to last a full day. I waited as long as I could, watching the sun sink. When the last light started fading, I arranged 3 crystals in a triangle on the old abandoned altar, placed the seed in the center, and activated it. The amber cracked open, a little flame snake slithered out, consumed the crystals, and a weak yellowish fire rose up. It covered maybe 30 square meters, barely anything. Then the flame started flickering like a candle in the wind. My heart nearly stopped. I threw in another crystal, and the fire stabilized. That left me with just 1. But right then, something strange appeared in my mind. A panel, like a game interface. It showed my territory stats: Sea Wind territory, broken camp level, candle grade fire, no buildings, no resources. And at the bottom, something was loading. Plant all things, harvest miracles. Before I could figure out what any of it meant, the darkness swallowed the sky. Night fell instantly, like someone dumped a bucket of ink across the sky. 1 second there was a dying sunset, the next, total darkness. I'd seen this every night for 18 years. But before I always watched from behind a massive Lord's Fire back home. Now I was crouching beside a flame barely covering 30 square meters. Then the sound started. Hissing, scraping, like snakes slithering just outside the light. I looked around and saw shadows moving at the edge, shapeless dark things crawling along the ground. When the firelight touched them, they sizzled and pulled back. But they didn't leave. They were waiting for my fire to die. Crawling Eries. The weakest kind. No rank at all, but they come in huge numbers. Within an hour, over a dozen surrounded my little circle of light. I clutched the black pendant my mother left me, her only keepsake. No magic in it, just memories. That's probably why the soldiers let me keep it. With nothing else to do, I studied the strange panel in my head. It showed me building recipes, tents, fences, but everything needed materials from Eerie corpses. Then I noticed something new had finished loading. The Eerie Field, a magical farming plot. The panel said I could plant anything and harvest something back. I had 3 slots, but only 1 was usable at my current fire level. I didn't dare plant my precious crystals, and I wouldn't risk my mother's pendant. So I grabbed a plain rock from the ground and tossed it into the field. It sank in, and a tiny blue-green sprout grew out of it. The panel said it would be ready in 2 hours. I sat down to wait, exhausted and starving. The constant hissing outside became background noise, and I drifted off to sleep. A cold wind on my back jolted me awake. The fire was flickering wildly. One of the larger crawling Eries had pushed halfway into my light circle, claws dug into the dirt, dragging itself toward me. It was burning up from the firelight, but still coming. Every inch it crawled was draining my crystals faster. I had no weapon, but then I glanced at the field. My stone had finished growing. It looked completely different now, sharp-edged, cracked, almost alive. I picked it up, cold to the touch. The panel called it an eerie cracked stone. It absorbs dark energy over time, getting stronger every hour. And when thrown, it explodes on impact. Right now it already had a 40% damage boost. I finally had something to fight back with. I smashed the magic stone right into the crawling Erie's head. It exploded like a grenade, splitting the creature's skull wide open. Black goo splattered everywhere. As the lord of this territory, I could stop the fire from burning the corpse away, a useful trick I remembered from my education. I spent the rest of the night planting and harvesting stones. By dawn, I had 3 more explosive rocks ready. When I spotted the first white dot in the black sky, the sign that night was ending, I threw all 3 into the mass of shadows outside my light. 3 booms echoed across the plains. When daylight ripped through the darkness, I saw the damage. Chunks of creatures scattered everywhere. I dug through the remains and found 5 crystal fragments, about half of 1 full crystal. Not much, but it was something. Then I had an idea. Instead of planting another rock, I dragged one of the more intact, eerie corpses into the field. The dark soil swallowed it whole, growing time, for hours, twice as long as a stone. The sprout even grew 2 leaves instead of 1. With a bonus option, planting during the night would make the result 20% stronger. I'd wasted that bonus, but I had another corpse saved for tonight. I slept for a few hours and woke up shivering from the cold wind. The field was almost done. The dark soil started moving, and something crawled out. It was an upgraded crawling Erie, smaller but meaner. Thicker claws, a mouth split ear to ear, rows of tiny sharp teeth dripping toxic slime. The panel called it a mutated crawling Erie, rated at 0 rank late stage with a combat value of 51. It could survive on crystal fragments or by eating other Erie corpses. The description basically said it was fearless, venomous, and disposable. Not exactly a noble knight's companion, but I finally had a fighter on my side. I spent the whole day planting stones and harvesting explosive rocks. By nightfall, I had 7 ready, plus my first mutated Erie was out patrolling. A second one crawled out of the field right after darkness fell, slightly stronger than the first, combat value of 63. I tried planting the bone dog corpse next, but the field showed something interesting. Each planted item grows different, leaves, with different bonus options. The bone dog's second leaf wanted another bone dog corpse to trigger a fusion mutation. I didn't have one, so I pulled it out and went back to growing stones. Then I had a breakthrough. I ordered one of my mutated Eries to handle the farming. Push out finished stones, drop in new ones, repeat. It worked. Clumsy, but it worked. I finally had a tireless worker running the field while I rested. Hunger was becoming a real problem, though. 2 days without food or water. I needed to explore the nearby mountains tomorrow, or I'd starve before the darkness ever got me. I dozed off by the fire. Sometime later, a horrible scraping sound woke me. One of my Eries had impaled an intruder right through the skull. Before I could relax, a second one pushed into the light from the other side. My mutant pounced and ripped it apart in 2 moves. But the attacks were getting bolder and more frequent. That worried me. The second night got much worse. More creatures swarmed my tiny circle of light. Not just crawling Eries anymore, but bone dogs, some kind of hairy monkey claw thing, and other monsters I couldn't even name. Dozens of claws were scratching at the edge of my territory, trying to push in, but I had 11 explosive stones ready, and 9 of them had been sitting long enough to reach maximum power, double damage. I grabbed them in handfuls and hurled all 9 into the thickest parts of the darkness. 9 explosions ripped through the night like thunder. The shockwave nearly blew out my own fire. Body parts, black blood, and shattered bone rained down inside my territory. A crystal fragment even flew straight at my face. I caught it midair. The blast didn't scare them, though. These things don't know fear. They came back even angrier. I sent both my mutated Eries charging out to the edge to fight. The battle lasted the rest of the night. When dawn finally broke, the damage was brutal on both sides. 6 eerie corpses and 1 bone dog lay inside my territory. My number 2 mutant survived, barely, covered in wounds. But my first one, the original worker, got dragged into the darkness by one of those monkey claw things. Gone. I collected 7 crystal fragments from the bodies inside, then spent an hour searching outside and found 17 more. 23 fragments total, roughly equal to 3 full crystals. A huge haul. Best of all, I now had 2 bone dog corpses. I planted them together in the field and used a crystal fragment to speed things up. The second leaf's fusion mutation finally activated. Whatever crawls out of that soil in a few hours should be something much stronger than a regular bone dog. After the second night's battle, I searched through the scattered remains outside my territory and discovered something useful. The monster corpses had specific parts one could harvest. Bone dog skeletons gave me thick bone rods. Crawling Eries had tough skin, strong tendons, and barbed tongues. I collected enough material to build my first structure, a simple tent. The building system worked just like the field. I selected the recipe, a shadow model appeared. I placed it near the fire, and it materialized instantly. 4 white bone poles crossed into a frame, covered with black eerie skin, tied down with tendons, and staked into the ground with barbed tongues. It looked creepy, but the panel said sleeping inside would speed up my recovery by 20% and block out the freezing wind. For someone who'd been sleeping on bare ground in the open sea breeze, that was a lifesaver. But my real crisis wasn't shelter, it was food. 2 full days without eating or drinking. Even with my trainee night body, I was dizzy, my throat was cracking, and swallowing tasted like blood. I had to find supplies or I'd die before the darkness ever got me. I took my surviving mutated Eerie and walked out across the plains to search. Nothing. No animals, no tracks, not even droppings. The land was completely dead. Just when I was desperate enough to consider eating raw Eerie flesh, I spotted a figure on a distant hill. A knight in black heavy armor, wandering aimlessly with dark fog leaking from his helmet. I recognized the family crest on the armor immediately. It was Roya, the knight captain who had escorted me here. He was dead, possessed by a soul-type Eerie and turned into a walking monster, what people call a living Eerie. These things don't disappear at dawn like normal monsters. They just keep wandering and killing. Worse, they're usually stronger than the person was when alive. Roya had been a black iron knight. I couldn't fight that with 1 mutated Eerie at my side. But his death gave me an idea. If Roya was turned, his whole escort squad was wiped out too. Eries only eat living things. They don't touch human food. That meant all the supplies the squad carried were still sitting at their temporary camp somewhere. Food, water, maybe equipment. My only hope of survival. The problem was distance. The camp was at least half a day away on horseback. On foot, I'd never make it back before nightfall, and being caught outside during the eternal night meant certain death. I needed a mount. When I got back to my territory, the answer was waiting for me right next to the field. The 2 bone dog corpses I'd planted together with a crystal fragment had finished growing. What crawled out was something terrifying and beautiful, a 2-headed bone dog. Massive, built from thick white bones with spikes running along its spine, 2 skulls with blue soul fire burning in the eye sockets, and heavy claws dug deep into the dirt. The panel called it a mutated 2-headed bone dog. 0 rank peak. Combat value of 92, nearly double my mutated Eerie. It was described as an untiring running machine with explosive power, no sense of pain, and extreme bloodlust. Recommended use: charging mount or living shield. It dropped flat to the ground the moment it saw me, both heads pressed into the dirt in total submission. I climbed onto its broad, bony back. The spikes on its spine were perfectly spaced to leave a riding gap, and 2 bone protrusions on its neck made natural handlebars. I finally had my ride. Tomorrow, I was going after those supplies. Before leaving, I fed 8 crystal fragments into the Lord's fire to keep it burning while I was gone. I left the mutated Eerie behind with orders to keep farming stones and kill anything that entered the territory. Then I climbed onto the 2-headed bone dog, and we launched out across the plains. The speed was unbelievable, faster than any warhorse I'd ridden back in the Golden Wheat Estate. The bone dog's claws ripped deep trenches in the hard ground with every leap. No saddle, no cushion, just raw bones slamming against my body with every stride. My empty stomach was doing flips, but the creature never slowed down, never got tired. That was the whole advantage of riding a dead thing. I followed the route I'd memorized from the prison card, heading toward the mountain range at the edge of the Sea Wind Plains. The escort squad had camped at the foot of those mountains on our last night together, too afraid to go deeper because of half-beast tribes and magical beasts in the peaks. When I reached the camp, it was exactly what I expected, a massacre site. Blood everywhere, dirt torn up, empty armor scattered around with not a single bone left inside. The temporary lord's fire on the old altar had gone out long ago. But the important thing was that the monsters had no interest in human supplies. I found the squad's wagon still loaded. I ripped open the first crate and nearly cried, water. Over a dozen full water skins. I drank half of one in a single breath and felt life pour back into my body. The sacks held dried meat, hard black bread, some softer white bread that must have been the captain's personal stash, and nuts. Enough food for maybe 2 weeks if I was careful. There were also spare linen clothes and a fur hide for warmth. The real treasure was a leather pouch with 2 full first-rank crystals and 6 fragments. That was the squad's backup fuel for their return trip. All mine now. I also grabbed Roya's knight sword, a first-rank weapon with the golden wheat crest on the guard. It was heavy and chipped, with silver-white fur stuck to the blade. That fur told me the truth. It wasn't Eries that killed the squad first. It was magical beasts. They probably destroyed the Lord's fire, and then the Eries finished the job during the night. I was loading everything onto the bone dog when a long wolf howl echoed from the mountains. 3 massive silver wolves, each nearly 2 meters long, burst out of the brush and charged straight at me. Silver moon wolves, first-rank magical beasts. Fast, vicious, pack hunters. Even a black iron knight like Roya couldn't handle them alone. I jumped on the bone dog and we ran. The wolves chased hard, closing the gap with terrifying bursts of speed. But I stayed calm. Wolves are flesh and blood. They get tired. My mount was a machine made of bone and dark energy that would run forever without slowing down. After half an hour of flat-out sprinting, the wolves fell behind, tongues hanging, fury fading into exhaustion. They howled at my back a few times and turned around. I didn't slow down. The sky was already changing color, and I had to reach my territory before the eternal night swallowed the world again. I almost didn't make it back. The sky turned black when I was still 100 meters from my territory. Crawling Eries spawned everywhere instantly, pouring toward me like a flood. The bone dog smashed through several of them head-on and launched us into the light circle with a final leap. 3 Eries got dragged in with us, claws jammed into the bone dog's leg joints. My mutated Erie and the bone dog ripped 2 apart in seconds. I grabbed Roya's heavy knight sword and pinned the last one to the ground myself, my first real kill. A few seconds later, and I would have died out there in the dark. Once I caught my breath, I focused on what mattered most, expanding my operation. I had enough crystals now to unlock the second field. 2 first-rank crystals and 8 fragments vanished into the system, and a new patch of black soil materialized next to the first one. I made a strategic decision that night. Explosive stones were fine for emergencies, but they were a dead end. 1 throw, a couple kills, nothing left to harvest. Mutated Eries were the real investment. Each one could fight for hours, kill multiple enemies, and leave intact corpses behind for more planting. I had 6 Erie bodies stockpiled already, plus whatever tonight's fighting would add. So I set up a proper production line. I assigned the mutated Erie to run both fields, drag a corpse in, toss in a crystal fragment to speed up growth, wait for the new mutant to crawl out, repeat. All through the night, during the darkness bonus that boosted every harvest by 20%. With the system running on its own, I finally let myself eat. I'd gone nearly 3 days without food. I tore into the white bread from Roya's personal stash, and the smell of wheat and faint sweetness almost made me dizzy. The black bread was rock hard, and the jerky needed soaking. But that soft bread went down like the best meal of my life. Outside the light circle, the Eries screamed and clawed louder than any night before. I didn't care anymore. I had food, water, weapons, 2 fields producing soldiers, and a bone dog that could outrun wolves. For the first time since being dumped on this wasteland, I wasn't just surviving, I was building something. I ate like a starving animal. 2 whole loaves of white bread, all the nuts, half a water skin of water. Back in the golden wheat estate, this kind of rough bread was food for low-ranking knights. Even the hunting dogs wouldn't touch it. But sitting on cracked dirt in a 30-square-meter circle of firelight, it tasted like the finest meal I'd ever had. The warmth spread through my stomach and my night energy started flowing again for the first time in days. The food coma hit me hard. I set up a guard rotation before passing out. The bone dog would patrol the perimeter and kick any dead Eries back into the darkness so they wouldn't drain my fire. I crawled into my creepy bone-in skin tent, wrapped myself in the fur coat I'd taken from the camp, and fell asleep in 3 seconds flat. I woke up feeling better than I had in days, fully rested, body at peak condition. Then I stepped outside, and my blood went cold. The Lord's fire had shrunk to the size of a fist, flickering on the edge of extinction. I dumped every crystal fragment I had left into the altar and barely stabilized it. The scene outside was chaos. Something in the darkness was throwing Eries into my territory like living projectiles. My bone dog was sprinting back and forth along the perimeter, biting them apart and kicking the corpses out as fast as they flew in. Meanwhile, 6 brand-new mutated Eries, produced overnight by the automated field system, were just standing around doing nothing because I hadn't given them orders yet. I yelled at them to fight, and they launched into action instantly. Even with 9 creatures defending my tiny territory, it was a mess. 7 mutated Eries, plus a massive 2-headed bone dog, plus incoming enemies, all crammed into 30 square meters. They were bumping into each other, tripping over corpses. I assigned one Erie to drag dead bodies toward the altar so the fighters had room to move. Then I saw it. A flash of crimson light deep in the darkness. A red eye? That meant a first-rank Erie was out there. Everything suddenly made sense. The bombardment of low-level Eries wasn't random. It was a test. That thing had been probing my defenses all night, watching, wearing down my fire, calculating. It had been the reason my crystals drained so fast while I slept. The dead bodies piled up fast. 11 corpses stacked near the altar like a small hill. Then the first-rank Erie lost patience. The ground at the edge of my light circle erupted. Over a dozen crawling Eries, 2 bone dogs, and a shriveled monkey corpse creature all got shoved inside at once. And behind them, a massive black claw reached into the light. Something much bigger and much more dangerous was coming in. The first-rank Erie forced its way into my territory, a monster the size of a full-grown lion, covered in black-red bone armor with burning crimson eyes. Its roar alone made the Lord's fire dim by a third. My bone dog charged it head-on and got launched backward like a toy, 2 ribs snapping on impact. The thing's claws were longer than my mutated Erie's entire bodies. It split one in half with a single swipe. I threw everything at it. All 6 remaining mutated Eries swarmed the creature, biting its legs and joints while the bone dog clamped both heads onto its neck. I wanted to use my explosive stones, but the fighting was too close. I'd kill my own troops. Meanwhile, the Lord's fire was dying. I dropped my sword, grabbed a knife, and started frantically cutting open the pile of dead Erie skulls next to the altar, digging out crystal fragments and feeding them straight into the flame. That's all I could do. Keep the fire alive 1 fragment at a time while my creatures fought for both our lives. It wasn't enough. The first-rank Erie shook off 2 of my mutated Eries and flung them into the darkness beyond the light. Gone. It crushed one of the bone dog's skulls with a single blow and sent the massive body tumbling into the field. 4 of my 7 mutated Eries were dead. I picked up the knight's sword and stood in front of the altar, ready to die fighting. Then the creature froze. It sensed something, dawn approaching. It screamed at me one last time, full of rage and hunger, turned around, and crawled back into the darkness. Seconds later, the sky cracked open and daylight flooded the plains. I survived, but barely. 3 mutated Eries left, 2 of them with broken legs. The bone dog had lost an entire head. Its spine snapped in 3 places. 10 more minutes of darkness, and I would have been dead. The one good discovery came while I watched my wounded creatures eat. The mutated Eries were chewing on dead Erie flesh, and their torn muscles and broken bones were visibly knitting back together. The bone dog was gnawing on a thick bone rod, and tiny bone threads were weaving a brand new skull where the crushed one had been, soul fire slowly reigniting in the empty eye socket. As long as they survived the fight, they could repair themselves by consuming their own kind. That saved me the cost of growing replacements from scratch. But the real problem remained. My territory was only 30 square meters. Too cramped to use numbers effectively. Too small to dodge a creature that outclassed everything I had. If I could expand to 100 square meters, I could field 20 mutated Eries and overwhelm even a first-rank monster through sheer volume under the Lord's fire suppression. The first-rank Erie would come back tonight, and it would attack earlier. I couldn't afford to rest. I sent my surviving creatures to drag intact corpses to the fields and eat the scraps to heal. I searched through the carnage myself, pulling 7 crystal fragments from the wreckage without flinching at the stench. A few days ago, I was a spoiled noble heir who never got his hands dirty. Now I was elbow-deep in monster guts, and it felt as natural as breathing. I had to find a way to kill that thing before sunset. I started the morning elbow-deep in dead monster skulls. After barely surviving the night, I had a field full of intact corpses and no time to waste. I pulled out my knife and began cutting open every head I could find, digging for crystal fragments. The regular-sized crawling Eries each had 1 fragment inside, which was normal. But the bigger ones, the ones that had been noticeably larger during the fight, had 2 crystals each. That was a nice surprise. The real jackpot came when I cracked open the monkey corpse Erie skull. The blade hit something hard, and I had to reach in and pull out 4 fragments, all fused together like kidney stones in the gray brain tissue, giving off an intense cold energy. High risk, high reward. That thing had been one of the more dangerous creatures shoved into my territory last night, and its crystal output matched. When I finished the count, I had 35 crystal fragments total. A new personal record. I threw 5 into the Lord's fire immediately to stabilize it. Combined with what I'd fed in during the night, the fire now had enough fuel for about 35 hours. That gave me breathing room for the first time since arriving on these plains. With the fire secured, I turned to rebuilding my forces. I dragged a bone dog corpse to the first field and planted it. The panel showed the usual options: 5 hours to mature, with the first leaf offering a speed boost for 1 crystal fragment and the second leaf requesting a second bone dog corpse for fusion mutation. I didn't hesitate. I tossed in a fragment and shoved the second bone dog body in right after. The soil churned violently and swallowed everything. 2 leaves sprouted and immediately fell off. Another fused 2-headed bone dog would be crawling out in about 3 hours. For the second field, I had something special, the monkey corpse Erie. I dragged it over by the ankle and dropped it in. 2 leaves grew, but 1 fell off immediately. I checked the panel and realized I'd accidentally triggered the second leaf's bonus condition. It required the creature to be planted within 3 hours of death, and since the fighting had only ended a short while ago, the condition was already met. The mutation would affect the monkey's hand specifically. The first leaf wanted 2 crystal fragments for a 50% speed boost, so I threw those in too. Both fields were now cooking. That gave me time to think, and what I thought about scared me. I could keep producing mutated Eries all day. By nightfall, I might have 10 or more new ones ready. But would that be enough to stop the first-rank Erie from coming back? I already knew the answer. Probably not. The gap between 0 rank and first rank wasn't just about strength, it was about durability. That lion-sized monster had bone armor covering its entire back. My mutated Eries could swarm it, sure, but in a 30 square meter space, only 2 or 3 could attack at the same time. The rest would just be standing around bumping into each other. Numbers meant nothing without room to use them. I needed a first-rank fighter of my own, something that could match that crimson-eyed beast blow for blow. That's when I noticed a black figure moving on a distant hilltop. My breath caught in my throat. It was Roya, or what was left of him. The former Black Iron Knight who had escorted me to this wasteland, now turned into a wandering living Erie. He drifted closer to my territory since yesterday, probably drawn by the noise and the smell of blood. A crazy idea started forming in my head. Roya had been a first-rank knight in life. As a living Erie, his combat power would be at least first-rank level, maybe stronger. If I could kill him and plant his body in the field, whatever grew out of that soil would be a genuine first-rank creature under my command. That would change everything. The idea was insane and dangerous. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Yes, living Eries are usually stronger than the person was when alive. But Roya had lost everything that made him a real threat. He had no intelligence anymore, just mindless killing instinct. No combat techniques, no tactical thinking. And crucially, no weapon. His knight sword was sitting in my territory right now, jammed between my bone dog's ribs. A beast running on pure instinct, fighting with bare hands, was a completely different challenge than a trained black iron knight with a blade. It was still risky. One wrong move, and I'd lose everything. But if I didn't do something, the first-rank crawling Eerie would come back tonight and finish what it started. And even if I survived tonight somehow, what about tomorrow? What about the night after that? Each night the attacks got worse. I was running out of time. Besides, Roya was already wandering toward me. If I didn't go after him, he'd eventually come to my territory on his own, probably at the worst possible moment. Better to fight on my terms than his. Decision made. I sat down by the altar and closed my eyes. I needed to rest and plan while the fields did their work. 3 hours later, the ground trembled under both fields at the same time. The first field cracked open and a new two-headed bone dog climbed out. Similar to the first one, but slightly bigger, bones shaped a little differently. The panel showed a combat value of 95, higher than the original. It walked over and knelt before me, both skulls pressed flat against the dirt. The second field produced something I hadn't seen before. A hand reached out of the soil, not a shriveled, dead monkey paw like the original, but a thick, muscular arm covered in gray-black fur with veins bulging under the skin. A creature less than a meter tall leaped out of the earth. Its body was still thin and dried out like the original monkey corpse Eerie, but its arms were completely transformed. Massive, powerful, almost absurdly oversized compared to its skinny frame. It crouched before me and crossed those huge arms on the ground, making a low, gurgling sound. I pulled up its information. Mutated monkey corpse Eerie. 0 rank peak. Combat value 89. The description said it had limited intelligence, more than the crawling Eries, which had none at all. It was agile, good at ambushes, and its mutated arms gave it tremendous strength. Most importantly, it could use objects as weapons with enhanced power, limited intelligence, and enhanced throwing arms. I was looking at a perfect grenade launcher. I immediately started building the battle plan in my head. When I went after Roya, the monkey would stay back and bombard him with maximum power explosive stones while the bone dogs charged in as heavy hitters and the mutated Eries swarmed the flanks. Range plus mass plus power. It could work. I tested the monkey's abilities right away. I pointed at 2 crawling Eerie corpses on the ground, then pointed at the 2 empty fields. The monkey gurgled once, walked over, grabbed a corpse with one massive arm like it weighed nothing, carried it to the first field, and threw it in. Then it picked up a single crystal fragment from the leather pouch on the ground, delicately, between 2 thick fingers, and dropped it into the soil. It turned around and repeated the exact same process with the second field. No confusion, no repeated instructions needed. The whole sequence was smooth and natural. This creature was on a completely different level from the crawling Eries when it came to following orders. Those things needed every step spelled out and would stand around doing nothing if I didn't give specific commands. The monkey understood the concept of a task. It saw what needed to be done, figured out the steps, and executed them. That, limited intelligence, was worth more than a dozen extra bodies. I had my automated production line running at full capacity now. 2 fields churning out mutated Eries every 2 hours with the speed boost. The monkey managing the whole operation, planting bodies, adding crystal fragments, clearing finished products. All without me lifting a finger. During the day I'd focus on growing more soldiers. By evening I needed to have enough firepower to hunt a first-rank living Eerie and still have reserves left over to defend against whatever nightmare came crawling out of tonight's darkness. I sat back against the supply sack and chewed on a strip of dried jerky, watching the monkey work. The old bone dog, the one with the regenerating skull, was gnawing on bones nearby, its second head already starting to take shape again as thin white threads of bone wove themselves into a dome. The 3 surviving mutated Eries were healing too, feeding on scraps. By tonight, they'd be combat ready. For the first time, I felt something beyond just survival instinct. I was thinking in terms of strategy, production capacity, resource management, force composition. The game panel in my head wasn't just a novelty anymore. It was the foundation of a military operation. Every corpse was raw material. Every crystal fragment was fuel. Every hour of daylight was manufacturing time. I was still just a trainee knight with no real combat ability, stranded on the most worthless piece of land in the entire kingdom, hunted by monsters every night, with a death sentence hanging over me from a corrupt king and a treacherous uncle. But sitting there watching my little army grow, chewing stolen jerky in front of a fire fueled by monster crystals, I felt something I hadn't felt since the day they threw me in that prison cart. I felt dangerous. Tonight, I would hunt Roya. Tomorrow, I would face the first-rank Eerie with a champion of my own. And every day after that, I would grow stronger, expand further, build higher. Until the day I rode out of this wasteland and made every single person who put me here regret it with their last breath. But first things first, I still had corpses to plant and stones to stockpile. The sun was high, the fields were churning, and the clock was ticking toward darkness. I got back to work. For hours after planting, 2 fresh mutated crawling Eries crawled out of the fields. I stood up and looked around my tiny territory. For the first time since being dumped on these plains, I had a real fighting force. 7 mutated crawling Eries crouched on the ground, dripping black slime. 2 peak 0-rank, 2-headed bone dogs stood like war machines, blue soul fire burning steady in their eye sockets. And the newest addition, the mutated monkey corpse Eerie, sat by the altar tossing a rock from hand to hand with those absurdly muscular arms, looking almost bored. It was time to hunt Roya. I'd been turning the plan over in my head all morning, and every angle kept pointing to the same conclusion. This was my only shot at surviving the coming night. The first-rank crawling Eerie with the crimson eyes would be back, and no amount of 0-rank soldiers crammed into 30 square meters would stop it. I needed a first-rank creature of my own. Roya's body was the key. A former Black Iron Knight turned living Eerie, his corpse would grow into something powerful enough to fight on equal terms with whatever the darkness threw at me. The monkey finished loading 2 more Eerie corpses into the fields for the automated production cycle. I packed 7 fully charged explosive stones into my leather pouch, grabbed Roya's knight's sword, and climbed onto one of the bone dogs. The blade slid neatly into a gap between the creature's ribs, held firm like a makeshift scabbard. I gave the order, and my entire army poured out of the territory, 7 Eries scrambling low across the ground, the monkey loping along on all fours, and both bone dogs charging ahead with me, riding one while the other scouted in front. The sea wind plains stretched out flat and dead in every direction. Nothing but cracked earth, dry grass, and the occasional low hill. Good terrain for what I had planned. No places for Roya to corner us. No tight spaces where his raw strength could dominate like it would inside my tiny territory. Out here, I could spread my forces and hit him from every angle. The scout bone dog came racing back after about an hour, soul fire flickering urgently. It had found him. I followed its lead until we reached a low hill, then dismounted and crawled to the top on my belly. Through the dry grass, I spotted him a few hundred meters out, a tall black figure stumbling across the wasteland with no purpose or direction. His face had rotted badly since I'd last seen him, half the skin gone, gray bones showing through the blackened flesh. One eye socket was completely hollow, leaking thick dark fog. The family crest on his battered armor was still visible, a grim reminder that this thing used to be a man who had escorted me to my death sentence just days ago. No horse, no sword, just a mindless killing machine wrapped in broken armor. Good. That was exactly what I was counting on. I slid back down the hill and handed the pouch of explosive stones to the monkey. It understood immediately. I could see something working behind those empty eyes, a flicker of tactical awareness that none of my other creatures possessed. It took the stones, climbed the hill with those powerful arms, and positioned itself at the crest. I gave the signal. The monkey's right arm pulled back like a siege catapult, every muscle in that grotesque limb coiling tight. Then it released. The first stone screamed through the air and hit Roya square in the back of the skull. The explosion was deafening. His helmet blew off and spun away across the dirt, and a chunk of rotting flesh ripped free from his head, exposing the black bone underneath. The impact knocked him face first into the ground. Before he could process what happened, the monkey launched the remaining stones in rapid succession. Explosion after explosion tore into Roya's body, shredding his already damaged armor, blasting holes in his back, scattering pieces of blackened organs across the dry earth. Each detonation echoed across the empty plains like thunder. I shouted the attack order. 7 mutated Eries shot forward like released arrows, hugging the ground, claws tearing up dirt as they closed the distance. Both bone dogs followed right behind, massive bone frames pounding the earth. I stayed on the hilltop with the sword in my hands, positioned next to the second bone dog in case I needed to mount up and flee. A lord's job is to command, not to charge into the meat grinder. At least that's what I told myself. The truth was simpler. I was a trainee knight with barely any combat ability, and getting within arm's reach of Roya would be suicide. Roya dragged himself off the ground. His heavy armor hung in ruins, his back had a hole the size of a dinner plate, and dark innards were spilling out onto the dirt. But none of that slowed him down. The moment he turned around and saw the wave of creatures charging him, something inside that dead body switched on. He roared, a wet, broken sound that leaked through the gaps in his ruined throat, and met the attack head-on. The first Eerie to reach him died in 2 punches. One blow caved in its skull. The second scattered it across the ground in a spray of black slime and bone fragments. It didn't even have time to scream. The second Eerie got its head ripped clean off Roya's hand, like he was pulling a cork from a bottle. 2 dead in the space of 3 heartbeats. I watched from the hill with sweat running down my sword hand. This was the gap between first rank and 0 rank laid bare. No technique, no skill, just overwhelming physical power applied with 0 hesitation. Roya was fighting on pure instinct and still tearing through my soldiers like they were made of wet paper. The remaining 5 Eries swarmed him from every side, claws raking across his armor and exposed flesh. They managed to tear off chunks of metal and dig into the muscle underneath, but Roya barely noticed. He grabbed one by the throat with his left hand and simply pulled. The Eerie's entire head and a length of spine came away in his fist, trailing black fluid. 3 more of my soldiers were dead before the bone dogs even arrived. Then the tide shifted, if only slightly. The first bone dog launched itself through the air, a massive projectile of white bone and blue flame. Both skulls clamped down on Roya's arms, locking his most dangerous weapons in place. Roya drove his knee into the dog's chest, and I heard ribs crack like dry branches, but the jaws held. The bone dog's teeth ground against the bone underneath Roya's rotting flesh, and it refused to let go even as its own skeleton fractured. The second bone dog hit him from behind, jaws closing around his thigh, and brought him crashing to the ground. The 4 surviving Eries piled on, biting and clawing at every exposed piece of him. The monkey dropped down from the hill and joined the fray, using those massive arms to pry at Roya's ribcage, snapping bones, and pulling out fistfuls of whatever was inside. Roya fought like a cornered animal. He thrashed and rolled on the ground with the full force of a first-rank being, dragging the 2 bone dogs that outweighed him across the dirt like they were stuffed toys. He managed to shake both of them loose with a violent twist of his torso, sending them tumbling. His foot came down on one Erie's spine and crushed it flat. His elbow caved in another's skull. 4 of my 7 Eries were gone now. But he was weakening. The explosive stones had done real structural damage. The bone dog's relentless biting had cracked his arm bones. The monkey had torn out most of his ribcage. And even a living Erie can't fight forever with half its body missing. Both bone dogs charged again. This time they went straight for the throat. For massive jaws locked around Roya's neck from both sides and bit down with everything they had. The sound of cracking bone cut through the wind. Roya's thick neck vertebrae splintered, and with a horrible wet tearing noise, his head came free and rolled across the ground. The black fog in his remaining eye socket guttered and died. Even headless, his body managed one final act. The hand still clutching a mutated Erie squeezed shut, crushing the creature into a mess of pulp and shattered bone. Then the massive armored corpse swayed once and toppled forward into the dirt. Silence. Just the wind through dead grass. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My arms were shaking and my grip on the sword had gone white-knuckled even though I'd never swung it once. This hadn't been a battle. It had been a meat grinder, and I'd fed most of my army into it. The cost was brutal. 5 of my 7 mutated Eries were dead. The 2 survivors were missing limbs and barely conscious. Both bone dogs had shattered bones everywhere, and their soul fires were guttering. Only the monkey came through untouched. Thanks to its intelligence, it had stayed on the edges the whole time, darting in for quick strikes and retreating before Roya could focus on it. But the injured ones could heal. Back at my territory, with enough Erie corpses to feed on, The bone dogs would regrow their broken parts, and the Eries would knit themselves back together. I'd seen it happen before. The losses weren't permanent. What mattered was the massive, headless body lying in the dirt in front of me. A first-rank living Erie corpse. The most valuable thing I'd ever possessed. Step 1 of the plan was complete. Now I needed to get this body back to my territory and into the field before the sun went down and the real nightmare began. I had hours, not minutes, but I wasn't taking any chances. I lashed Roya's corpse to the back of the stronger bone dog, climbed onto the other one, and started the long ride home. We dragged Roya's body back to the territory like a hunting party returning with a kill. The monkey handled most of the heavy lifting, stuffing his spilled guts back into his torso, jamming his severed head onto one of the bone dog's back spikes, piling the whole mess onto the wider of the 2 bone dogs for transport. I rode the other one. Behind us limped what was left of my army. 2 mutated Eries missing legs and arms, both bone dogs cracked and flickering. Only the monkey walked tall, completely untouched, those ridiculous arms swinging at its sides. When we crossed back into the 30-meter light circle, the wounded creatures didn't even wait for orders. The Eries threw themselves at the pile of dead bodies near the fields and started tearing into them like starving dogs. Black slime and chunks of flesh flew everywhere as they fed, and I watched their wounds slowly close, torn muscles reconnecting, shattered bone knitting back together piece by piece. The bone dogs went straight for the thick leg bones and started gnawing, and I could already see thin white threads spreading across their cracked rib cages, building new bone to replace what Roya had destroyed. I sat down for a few minutes to rest and circulate my night energy. It wasn't much. Trainee-level combat aura barely counts as anything in this world, but it helped push back the exhaustion gnawing at my edges. While I rested, the 2 fields finished their current cycle. 2 fresh, mutated Eries crawled out of the dirt, shook themselves clean, and dropped at my feet. More soldiers for the line. With the fields empty, I turned my attention to Roya's corpse. A wild idea had been bouncing around in my head the whole ride home. Every time I'd planted a damaged Erie body, the field had regrown the missing parts during the planting process. Broken limbs came back whole, crushed skulls reformed, torn flesh filled in. So what if I only planted a piece of Roya? Could I grow 2 of him? 3. An entire squad of first-rank knights from a single body? I pulled out my knife and cut off Roya's right pinky finger. It came away with a wet snap, blackened and stiff. I walked to the first field and dropped it in. The panel appeared immediately. 3 hours to mature. 1 leaf, just the basic speed boost option. No fusion leaf, no mutation trigger, nothing special. 3 hours and 1 leaf was the same output tier as planting a plain rock. The field had looked at this finger and decided it was raw material, not a creature. It couldn't grow a whole knight from a single digit. I pulled the finger back out and tossed it onto Roya's chest. So much for that shortcut. The field needed a mostly complete body to recognize it as a living thing and fill in the gaps. Too much missing, and it just treated the remains as spare parts. No duplicating first-rank knights from fingertips. The rules of this system had limits, and I'd just found one. Fine. 1 Roya would have to be enough. I had the monkey drag a regular Erie corpse into the first field and drop in a crystal fragment. Keeping the production line running was still critical. Then I walked to the second field myself. This one was for the main event. Roya's body was heavy, even with pieces missing and organs falling out. The armored corpse must have weighed close to 200 pounds. I grabbed him under the arms and dragged him across the dirt, leaving a trail of black smear behind us, until I got him positioned over the center of the second field. I stopped for a moment and looked at his face. Most of it was gone, rotted away or blown off by the explosive stones, but I could still make out the shape of his jaw and the ridge of his brow. I remembered this face from the prison cart. Stone cold, professional, looking at me like I was already a ghost. He'd been one of my family's trained knights, raised and equipped by the Golden Wheat household. When my uncle made his move, Roya switched sides without hesitation. A career soldier following the new power, nothing personal. But I also remembered that he hadn't made things worse during the transport. He could have beaten me, starved me, humiliated me for his new master's approval. He didn't. He did his job, and nothing more. Maybe that was the last shred of a knight's honor. Or maybe he just didn't care enough to be cruel. Either way, it counted for something. I let go and his body sank into the black soil. The earth churned and swallowed him whole. Armor, bones, rotting flesh, everything. What grew out of the field made my eyes go wide. A thick stalk, almost a foot tall, burst through the surface, and on it grew 4 leaves. 4. Every other planting I'd done had produced 1 or 2 leaves at most. The bone dogs with their fusion mutation got 2. Even the monkey with its death timer bonus only had 2. 4 leaves meant this was something on a completely different level. I read the panel carefully. 24 hours to mature. That was the base time, far longer than anything I'd grown before. The first leaf was the standard acceleration option, but the price matched the product. 2 full first-rank crystals to cut the growth time by 60%. Not crystal fragments. Full crystals. That would cost me 16 fragments, which was almost everything I had left. The second leaf wanted a weapon added to the planting. If I gave the growing knight a weapon, his combat power would increase dramatically upon hatching. The third leaf wanted a mount. Same deal, major combat boost if I could provide one. The fourth leaf made me choke. It said, perform a gymnastics routine beside the field, and the knight would randomly learn an active combat skill upon maturation. I read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Dance beside the dirt patch and my undead knight gets a special move. The system had been strange from the start, planting rocks to grow grenades, growing monsters from corpses. But this was a new kind of absurd. The leaves had been getting progressively weirder with each planting, and apparently this was where that trend ended up. Interpretive dance for combat bonuses. But the reward was too good to pass up. An active skill could be the difference between killing the first-rank crawling Eerie tonight and getting torn to shreds. I'd be an idiot to skip it over embarrassment. First things first. I counted out 16 crystal fragments from my pouch and threw them all into the field. That was the equivalent of 2 first-rank crystals, and it hurt watching them dissolve into gray smoke. My reserves dropped to almost nothing. Just 4 fragments left, barely enough to keep the Eerie production going. But the timer on the panel slashed in half, from 24 hours down to just under 10. I checked the sky. The sun was past its peak and sliding west. Maybe 4 or 5 hours until the eternal night fell. That meant Roya would finish growing sometime in the middle of the night. I'd have to survive the first half on my own. Next, the weapon. I walked over and pulled Roya's knight sword out of the bone dog's ribcage where I'd been storing it. A first-rank weapon with the golden wheat family crest on the guard. Chipped, stained with monster blood, but still sharp and heavy. It had been his blade in life, and now it would be his blade in whatever he became after the field was done with him. I drove it point first into the dark soil. The earth grabbed it and pulled it under in seconds. The second leaf withered and dropped. The mount was trickier. I looked around the barren plains. No horses, no beasts, no animals of any kind within a day's ride. The only creatures with 4 legs and enough speed to serve as a mount were my bone dogs. I stared at the larger of the 2, the one that had just finished healing its cracked bones. It wasn't ideal. A 2-headed skeleton dog made of monster parts wasn't exactly a noble knight's war charger, but it was fast, tireless, durable, and already trained to follow my commands. And honestly, when your options are bone dog or nothing, the choice makes itself. I pointed at the field and gave the order. The bone dog walked forward without resistance, stepped onto the dark soil, and let itself sink. The earth swallowed its massive white frame bone by bone until only the tips of its skull spikes remained. Then those 2 disappeared. The third leaf fell. 1 leaf remaining. The embarrassing one. I looked around the territory. 7 mutated Eries, 1 bone dog, the monkey, all present. All watching me with whatever passed for curiosity in creatures without real intelligence. I ordered every single one of them to turn around. They obeyed instantly, rotating in place until their backs faced me. The monkey was last, tilting its head with what I swear was amusement before slowly turning away. I stood alone in front of a patch of black dirt, wearing tattered noble clothes and a beast fur coat, on a wasteland at the edge of a dying kingdom, surrounded by monsters I'd grown from corpses in magic soil. And I was about to perform a children's exercise routine from my previous life on Earth. The only gymnastics I knew was the second national broadcast calisthenics set, Young Eagle Takes Flight. Every student in China did it during the mandatory morning exercise break between classes. I'd done it thousands of times between the ages of 7 and 15, hating every second. The music was burned into my brain so deep that even 18 years in another world couldn't erase it. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath. The phantom melody started playing in my head, tinny speakers echoing across a concrete schoolyard on a planet impossibly far away. The era is calling. Section 1, Stretching Exercises. My arms went out stiff as boards. Left leg kicked forward. I counted under my breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Moving through the chest expansions, the arm circles, the leg swings, the jumping jacks. The cold wind howled across the sea wind plains, and inside a tiny circle of magical firelight, a former noble heir bounced up and down, doing children's calisthenics for an audience of monsters who had been ordered not to watch. It was the most ridiculous thing I had ever done in 2 lifetimes. Every section of the routine came back to me with painful clarity. The awkward hip twists, the arm-pumping jumps, the final cool-down stretches. My body remembered the motions even when my pride begged me to stop. I kept going because somewhere under that dirt, a first-rank knight was absorbing the information and turning it into a killing technique. And if jumping around like a fool for 5 minutes meant the difference between living and dying tonight, then I would jump until my legs gave out. When I finished the last movement and dropped my arms to my sides, breathing hard, the 4th leaf on the stalk turned brown and fell into the soil. All 4 conditions met. Now I just had to survive until Roya finished cooking. After finishing that humiliating gymnastics routine, I ate a quick meal of rock-hard black bread and salty dried meat soaked in water from my canteen. The food was awful. Nothing like the fine meals I used to have back in the Golden Wheat estate, but it filled my stomach and gave my body the energy it desperately needed. I'd been burning through calories at an insane rate between the fighting, the traveling, and the constant stress of trying not to die every single night. I checked the sky. The sun was already dropping toward the horizon, painting everything in that sickly orange light that meant I had maybe an hour or 2 before the eternal night swallowed the world again. I ran through the math in my head. Roya's body needed about 10 hours to finish growing in the field, thanks to the 16 crystal fragments I'd spent to speed things up. That meant he wouldn't be ready until deep into the night, probably around the halfway point of the darkness. The first half of every eternal night was usually the safer part, with only 0-rank creatures wandering around testing my defenses. The real danger always came later, when the stronger monsters showed up and the attacks escalated. If I was lucky, the first-rank crawling Eerie with the crimson eyes would hold off its assault until after Roya hatched. If I was unlucky, well, I'd deal with that when it happened. I'd been dealing with nothing but bad luck since the day they threw me in that prison cart, and I was still breathing. I ducked into my creepy little tent made of monster bones and skin, pulled the beast fur coat tight around my shoulders, and closed my eyes. Sleep wasn't a luxury anymore. It was a tactical resource. Every hour of rest translated directly into sharper reflexes and better decision-making when things went sideways, and things always went sideways on the sea wind plains. I don't know exactly when the eternal night fell. I was already unconscious when it happened, but I'd seen it enough times to know what it looked like. No gradual darkening, no twilight fading into stars. Just an instant switch from dim daylight to absolute, suffocating blackness, like someone had dropped a curtain made of solid ink over the entire sky. The darkness here wasn't ordinary nighttime. It had weight to it, pressure, like the whole atmosphere was pressing down on the earth trying to crush everything underneath. When I woke up, the first thing I did was touch my own head. Still attached. Good start. I pushed open the tent flap, and the freezing air hit my neck like a slap. Outside, the Lord's fire was still burning on the altar, its pale yellow glow holding back the darkness across our tiny 30-square-meter island of safety. I scanned the territory and counted my forces. 8 mutated crawling Eries crouched around the altar. 4 of them still had fresh black dirt clinging to their bodies. They'd been produced while I slept, which meant I'd been out for over 8 hours. The automated production line had kept running perfectly. The monkey planted bodies, added crystal fragments, pulled out the finished product, and started the next batch, all without me lifting a finger. That creature's limited intelligence was worth more than a dozen extra soldiers. I checked the panel in my head. Roya's progress bar was more than 3/4 full, less than 2 hours until he finished growing. If I could hold the line until then, everything would change. The territory was remarkably clean. My soldiers had been following their standing orders all night. Kill anything that crosses the light boundary. Throw the corpses back outside. The system worked, but it was also painfully inefficient. Every dead Eerie that got tossed back into the darkness was a wasted resource. Those bodies contained crystal fragments I needed and raw materials I could use. Throwing them away was like burning money. Then I looked at the monkey, squatting near the edge of the light with those absurdly oversized arms resting on the ground, and an idea hit me. Why wait for the monsters to come to us? The monkey was strong enough to reach into the darkness, grab a creature, and drag it inside. We could pull them in one at a time, kill them on our terms, and keep the bodies instead of throwing them out. Turn the whole operation from passive defense into active harvesting. I waved the monkey over and pointed at the darkness. Go pull them in. The monkey understood immediately. It moved to the edge of the light circle, those massive arms coiled with muscle, and plunged both hands into the blackness beyond. There was a brief hiss and a squeal, and the monkey hauled a crawling Eerie into the firelight by its neck. The thing barely had time to register what was happening before the monkey twisted its head around, like wringing out a wet towel. Dead in seconds. I assigned roles on the spot. The monkey would be our fisher, reaching into the dark and pulling in prey. For mutated Eries would stand right behind it, ready to swarm and kill whatever came through before it could drain the Lord's fire's energy. 3 more Eries and the bone dog would patrol the rest of the perimeter, catching any strays that tried to sneak in on their own. The last Eerie got the least glamorous job, corpse duty. Its only task was to drag the dead bodies to a pile near the altar so the fighters had room to work. The system clicked into place like a well-oiled machine. The monkey grabbed, the Eries killed, the hauler stacked, and the cycle repeated. Every 30 seconds or so, another dead Eerie joined the growing pile. The monkey even managed to snag a bone dog at one point. It grabbed the white skeletal creature and slammed it against the ground like a rag doll. In terms of raw physical strength, the mutated monkey might not have been the strongest overall fighter in my little army, but when it came to pure grip and pull power, nothing else came close. Within an hour, we had over a dozen corpses stacked by the altar, including 2 bone dogs. I was doing the math in my head. At this rate, by dawn I'd have enough crystal fragments to fuel the Lord's fire for days, plus enough bodies to keep the production fields running non-stop. The territory was becoming a self-sustaining ecosystem of death and recycling. Monsters attacked. My creatures killed them. I harvested the crystals and planted the bodies to grow more creatures who killed more monsters. A closed loop that got stronger with every rotation. I was actually starting to feel good about the situation when the red light appeared. It flickered at the edge of my vision, just a brief flash of crimson in the absolute darkness, maybe 300 meters out. My stomach dropped. I knew that color. I'd seen it last night, right before a lion-sized monster with bone armor had nearly destroyed everything I'd built. The first-rank crawling Eerie was back, and it was early. I barked the order before I'd even finished processing the thought. Stop pulling. Everyone fall back to defensive positions. The monkey yanked its arms out of the darkness and retreated. The Eries collapsed inward, forming a tight ring around the altar. The bone dog planted itself at the widest gap in the formation. Every creature in my army went from harvesting mode to combat mode in the span of 2 heartbeats. The efficient little slaughterhouse I'd built went dead silent. All I could hear was the crackle of the Lord's fire and the endless hissing from beyond the light. Then the hissing turned into screaming. A wave of creatures exploded into the light circle, not 1 or 2 at a time like before, but over a dozen at once, shoved in by massive force. Crawling Eries, bone dogs, a monkey corpse Eerie, and something I'd never seen before, a rolling ball of stitched-together flesh about a meter wide, leaving a trail of black slime as it tumbled across the ground. The panel in my head labeled it a meatball Eerie, 0 rank. Disgusting didn't begin to cover it. Behind this wall of cannon fodder, the real threat pushed its way in. The first-rank crawling Eerie was even more terrifying than I remembered. Black-red armored hide, bone plates covering its spine, claws the length of my forearm, and those burning crimson eyes fixed directly on me. Last night it had been cautious, testing my defenses, throwing in sacrificial troops, waiting for an opening. Tonight it skipped all of that. Tonight it came in swinging from the very first second. The Lord's fire reacted to the invasion by flaring up, the pale yellow flame surging higher as it tried to suppress the flood of dark creatures. But that minute was burning through crystal energy at a catastrophic rate. Every second these things stayed inside the light circle was costing me fuel I couldn't afford to waste. I planted my feet in front of the altar, drew a deep breath, and gave the only order that mattered. Kill everything. My creatures launched themselves into the chaos. 8 mutated Eries hit the wave of zero-rank monsters like a wall of claws and teeth. The bone dog charged the nearest cluster and started crushing skulls. The monkey grabbed the meatball creature and literally tore it in half with its bare hands, sending chunks of sewn-together flesh flying in every direction. But none of them went for the first-rank Erie. Not yet. They knew, or at least their instincts told them, that the small ones had to die first, or we'd be fighting on 2 fronts with no room to maneuver. The first-rank Erie didn't wait for an invitation. It surged forward through its own expendable troops, crushing one under its massive claw without even looking down, and headed straight for the altar, straight for the fire, straight for me. I tightened my grip on nothing. Roya's sword was buried in the field, growing alongside its future owner. I had 2 knives on my belt and the combat ability of a trainee knight, which in practical terms meant I could maybe wound a large rabbit if it held still. Against a first-rank monster, I was a speed bump, but I didn't move. The altar was behind me. The fire was behind me. If that went out, everyone died. Me, the Eries, the bone dog, the monkey, and the half-formed knight still cooking in the soil beneath my feet. I could feel the faint warmth of the field's energy pulsing through the ground under my boots. Roya's body, transforming into something new barely 2 hours away from completion. 2 hours. I just needed 2 more hours. The bone dog intercepted the first-rank Erie before it reached me, slamming into its flank with both heads snapping at its legs. 3 mutated Eries peeled off from the zero-rank cleanup and threw themselves at the monster's back. The monkey circled wide, looking for an opening to grab a limb. The battle for the second half of the night had begun, and it was going to be the worst one yet. The moment I gave the kill order, my entire army surged forward into the mess of zero-rank creatures that had been shoved into my territory. The bone dog plowed through a pack of bone dog Eries, ripping one apart with both jaws. The monkey hammered its massive fists down on crawling Eries like a blacksmith working an anvil, punching heads straight through rib cages. The meatball thing, that disgusting rolling mass of stitched-together flesh, got stomped into paste by 3 of my mutated Eries working together. Under the Lord's fire suppression, these zero-rank invaders didn't stand a chance. My soldiers tore through them in minutes. But the first-rank crawling Erie wasn't here for a fair fight. While my forces were busy mopping up the cannon fodder, it charged straight through the chaos like a battering ram, shoving aside its own expendable troops, heading directly for me and the altar behind me. It had learned from last night. No more testing, no more patience. This time it was going for the kill shot, destroy the fire, and everything else dies with it. I screamed the order to redirect. Every single one of my creatures abandoned the remaining zero-rank targets and turned to face the real threat. The monkey got there first. It launched itself off the ground using those grotesque, oversized arms, soaring through the air with both fists raised overhead, bringing them down toward the first-rank Erie skull with everything it had. The monster didn't even slow down. It raised one armored claw, casually, almost lazily, and met the monkey's descending arms mid-swing. The sound that followed was like 5 swords cutting through wet wood simultaneously. The bone claws sliced through the monkey's mutated muscles, severed both arm bones clean through, and sent the monkey's most valuable assets tumbling to the dirt in 2 twitching chunks. The monkey crashed to the ground, armless, helpless, making that pathetic gurgling sound from its throat. Its entire identity, the thing that made it useful, that made it special, had been cut away in a single motion. One hit. The creature I'd been relying on for harvesting, for throwing explosive stones, for doing all the heavy lifting that required actual intelligence, crippled beyond usefulness in the blink of an eye. The bone dog tried a smarter approach. Instead of charging head-on, it slid in from the side and clamped both skulls onto the first-rank Erie's rear leg joint, teeth grinding against bone armor, trying to lock down the creature's mobility. For about half a second, it worked. The monster stumbled, let out a furious shriek, and then simply kicked. The physics of it were obscene. My bone dog weighed hundreds of pounds and was anchored to the ground with all 4 clawed feet. The first-rank Eerie flicked its leg and sent the entire skeleton flying through the air like a kicked ball. The bone dog hit the ground with a sound like a building collapsing, spine shattered in multiple places, ribs turned to powder, both heads drooping limp with their soul fires barely flickering. It tried to stand and couldn't. The strongest creature in my army, reduced to a broken heap of white bones in one move. 8 mutated Eries swarmed from every direction, biting and clawing at anything they could reach. Neck, belly, legs, tail. For a moment, the first-rank Eerie disappeared under a pile of writhing black bodies. I dared to hope that maybe, with enough of them attacking at once, they could find a weak spot. Then it rolled over. 2 of my Eries were directly underneath when it dropped its full weight on them. They didn't just die. They were compressed into flat smears of black paste, organs and bone fragments spraying outward like someone had stepped on a tube of paint. The monster stood back up and started swatting. Left claw punched through one Eerie's chest and ripped it in half lengthwise. Right claw smashed another skull down into its own body cavity. The remaining 4 tried to keep fighting but got backhanded away like annoying insects. All 4 sent tumbling across the territory floor. 10 minutes. That's all it took. My entire defense force, 8 mutated Eries, a peak 0-rank bone dog, and a mutated monkey with arms strong enough to tear bone dogs apart, had been systematically dismantled by a single creature. 4 Eries were dead. 4 more lay broken on the ground. The bone dog couldn't move. The monkey was bleeding out from 2 arm stumps. The total damage I'd inflicted on the first-rank Eerie amounted to a few white scratches on its leg armor and a small patch of scraped skin on its belly. That was it. All that fighting, all those bodies, and I'd barely marked it. The Lord's fire was sizzling against the monster's hide, making its outer skin slowly rot and smoke. But the creature didn't care. Whatever pain the fire caused was clearly tolerable, because it kept moving forward, those crimson eyes locked onto me with absolute focus. It knew exactly what it was doing. Kill the Lord, and the fire dies. Kill the fire, and the darkness pours in. Simple. 3 meters away. I could smell it, a thick, rotting stench like a mass grave in summer. Then 1 meter. I could see the shreds of my own Eries caught between its teeth, black flesh dangling from its jaw. Its mouth was wide enough to bite me in half. There was nowhere to run. Behind me was the altar with its dying fire. Beyond the light circle was an ocean of darkness filled with thousands more monsters. Running meant dying in the dark instead of dying in the light. At least here I could face it. I pushed every drop of trainee-level night energy through my body, feeling it surge through my limbs like warm water, pathetically weak compared to what a real knight could produce, but it was everything I had. I pulled both knives from my belt and set my feet. If this was the end, I'd go down swinging. I'd carve something into this thing's face so when they found my bones, they'd know I fought. The first-rank Eerie's hind legs coiled beneath it, muscles bunching for the killing lunge. Its mouth opened wide, rows of teeth gleaming wet in the firelight. This was the moment. 1 leap, and it would be on top of me, and no amount of trainee-level combat energy would stop those jaws from closing around my skull. Then the ground moved. Both fields trembled at the same time. A vibration I felt through the soles of my boots, deep and resonant, like something massive was waking up beneath the surface. The first field cracked open and spat out a brand-new mutated Eerie, still covered in fresh dirt. It shook its head once, let out its very first screech, and I pointed at the first-rank monster and shouted the only order I could think of. Buy me time. It didn't hesitate. This creature that had been alive for less than 3 seconds threw itself directly at the first-rank Eerie with 0 self-preservation instinct. The monster's killing lunge at me was interrupted as it swatted at this new annoyance. 1 claw punched straight through the newborn Eerie's body and pinned it to the ground. The little creature thrashed and clawed uselessly at the armored hide above it, fighting with everything it had until the light left its eyes. Born and dead in under 30 seconds. But those 30 seconds changed everything. The second field erupted. A column of freezing death energy blasted upward from the black soil, so intense that even the Lord's fire dimmed for a moment. The air temperature around the field dropped so sharply I could see my breath crystallize. Something was rising out of that earth, something fundamentally different from anything the fields had produced before. A horse came first. Not a living horse, a war mount built entirely from bleached white bone, every joint articulated, every rib perfectly formed, for hooves wreathed in blue soul fire that left scorch marks on the ground where it stepped. It leaped clear of the soil with a grace that seemed impossible for something made of dead material, landing with a heavy impact that shook the entire territory. On its back sat a knight. He was tall, taller than Roya had been in life. Black armor covered every inch of his body, darker than the eternal night outside, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Through the narrow slit in his helmet, 2 points of crimson light burned, not the wild, bestial red of the first-rank Eerie, but a cold, controlled, intelligent crimson. The eyes of something that understood what it was and what it was built to do. In his right hand, he held the knight sword-eyed buried in the field hours ago. But it wasn't the same weapon anymore. The chips and nicks in the blade had healed completely, the edge restored to a mirror-sharp line. And coiling around the steel like living vines were ribbons of solid black energy, death essence made visible, writhing along the blade with a hunger I could almost feel in my bones. This was what the field had made from Roya's corpse, his sword, my bone dog, 16 crystal fragments, and one extremely embarrassing gymnastics routine. A black iron rank skeleton knight. First rank peak. The panel identified him clearly, and for the first time since I'd received this strange ability, I felt genuine awe at what it could create. The skeleton knight, my skeleton knight, looked down from his bone horse at the first-rank crawling Eerie. The monster had frozen mid-step, its killing intent redirected entirely. It could feel what I could feel. This new arrival wasn't prey. This was a predator on its own level, maybe above it. Every bone plate on the Eerie's body stood upright like the hackles on a cornered dog, and for the first time since I'd encountered this creature, I heard something in its voice that sounded almost like fear. It attacked anyway. Maybe fear wasn't something it could process. Maybe instinct just overrode everything else. The first-rank Eerie launched itself off the ground, jaws gaping wide enough to swallow the horse's skull whole, claws extended for a strike that had been killing my soldiers all night with casual ease. The skeleton knight nudged the bone horse forward. It moved with shocking agility for something so large, sidestepping the lunge with a dancer's precision. At the same moment, the knight raised his right arm, slowly, almost ceremonially, and the black energy around his sword exploded outward, tripling the blade's length until it was a 2-meter crescent of pure darkness. He brought it down in a single horizontal arc. The panel in my head flickered with 2 words I'd never seen before: Black Radiance horizontal slash. That was the skill, the one earned by a disgraced noble heir doing children's calisthenics in front of a field full of monster dirt while his undead servants politely looked the other way. Every second of that humiliation, every arm circle and jumping jack and hip twist from the second national broadcast exercise routine, Young Eagle Takes Flight, had been absorbed by the field and converted into this single devastating technique. The black blade swept through the air, and I swear the darkness outside the light circle flinched. The black crescent of energy that left Roya's sword was the most terrifying and beautiful thing I'd ever seen. It tore through the air so fast it left a visible vacuum trail behind it, a line of nothingness carved into reality itself. The blade of dark energy hit the first-rank crawling Eerie. While it was still mid-leap, suspended in the air with its jaws wide open, claws extended, every ounce of its monstrous power committed to the killing strike that was supposed to end my life. The energy passed through its body like the creature wasn't even there. For one frozen heartbeat, nothing happened. The Eerie's momentum carried it forward, and it crashed to the ground at the bone horse's feet, skidding 2 meters through the dirt before stopping. Then, with a wet splitting sound that I'll never forget, the entire body separated down the middle into 2 perfectly symmetrical halves. The cut was so clean it looked surgical, smooth as glass, organs and black fluid spilling out in a neat line between the 2 pieces. No thrashing, no final screech. Just instant, absolute death. The thing that had slaughtered my entire army in 10 minutes, the monster that had been 1 second away from biting my head off, was reduced to 2 slabs of cooling meat by a single swing of a sword. The energy slash didn't stop there either. It kept going past the corpse and sailed into the darkness beyond my territory, and I heard the sounds of flesh being carved open out there. Collateral damage hitting whatever unlucky creatures had been lurking just outside the light. Even the horde of Eries pressing against my perimeter went silent. For the first time in 4 nights on this wasteland, the constant hissing and scraping outside stopped completely. Whatever intelligence these monsters possessed, even at the most basic instinctual level, recognized that something had fundamentally changed inside this little circle of firelight. Something that could reach out into their darkness and kill them there. I stood rooted to the spot, chest heaving, hands still gripping my 2 pathetic little knives. My legs were shaking, not from fear that had burned itself out about 30 seconds ago when I'd accepted I was about to die. This was the aftermath, the flood of relief and shock and adrenaline crashing through my body now that the danger had passed so suddenly and so completely. Roya's bone horse snorted, 2 plumes of black smoke jetting from its nostrils. The skeleton knight himself dismounted with a fluid motion that seemed impossible for something wearing that much heavy armor. His boots hit the ground with a solid metallic thud, and he walked toward me with measured, deliberate steps. Every movement radiated a controlled power that was completely different from the mindless violence of the Eries I'd been fighting. This wasn't a beast. This was a soldier. He stopped exactly 1 pace away from me. Then he reversed his grip on the sword, drove it point first into the dirt between us, and dropped to 1 knee. His armored fist pressed against his chest, and his helmet dipped in a gesture of absolute submission. When he spoke, the voice that came out was low and rough, like gravel being dragged across stone. But the words were clear. My blade points only where my lord commands. I looked down at this creature that had once been a man who betrayed my family, a knight who had chosen my uncle over my father, who had escorted me to what was supposed to be my execution by abandonment, and who had then died in the wilderness and been turned into a mindless, undead horror. Now he knelt before me, reborn from magic soil, stronger than he'd ever been in life, bound to my will completely. There was a poetic justice in it that I didn't have the energy to fully appreciate in the moment. I took a deep breath and forced my voice into something steady and commanding. A lord's voice. Even if the lord was an 18-year-old in torn noble clothes standing in a field of monster guts. Rise. Take the wounded to the corpse pile so they can feed and heal. He obeyed instantly. Watching him work was almost surreal. The bone dog that had been the backbone of my defense. A creature that took me hours of careful planning and resources to grow. Roya picked it up by the spine with 1 hand and tossed it onto the pile of dead Eries like it weighed nothing. He gathered the broken mutated Eries with the same casual efficiency, depositing each one near enough to a corpse that they could start feeding and regenerating on their own. While he worked, I pulled up his panel information and felt my jaw drop. Combat value, 498. My previous strongest creature, the 2-headed bone dog at its peak, had scored 95. Roya was more than 5 times that. He wasn't just stronger than everything else in my territory combined. He existed on a completely different scale. And the panel noted something even more exciting, growth potential. By absorbing dark energy from eerie corpses over time, he could eventually break through to 2nd rank. This wasn't just a powerful soldier. This was a seed that could grow into something truly terrifying. His special technique, Black Radiance Horizontal Slash, had a 5-hour cooldown. That meant once per night at most, maybe twice if the timing worked out. But given that a single use had instantly killed a late-stage first-rank Eerie, once was probably enough for most situations. Everything else could be handled with his baseline combat ability, which was clearly more than sufficient to deal with anything at the 0-rank level. All of this from planting 1 corpse, 1 sword, 1 bone dog, 16 crystal fragments, and 5 minutes of a children's exercise routine. The embarrassment of bouncing around doing Young Eagle Takes Flight in front of my monster army felt very far away now. If someone told me I'd have to do it every day for the rest of my life to keep producing results like this, I'd start stretching right now. The immediate crisis resolved, I turned my attention to the spoils. A gray piece of paper was floating above the first-rank Erie's split corpse, hovering with an unnatural stillness that made my skin prickle. I recognized what it was from my noble education, a treasure blueprint. These were extremely rare drops from killed Eries, completely random, unrelated to the creature's rank. Some were useful, some were worthless, and most required extensive research by specialized organizations to even understand. Every kingdom had scholars dedicated to studying these things. The most famous example in history was the Lord's Fire Altar itself, humanity's most essential survival tool, originally built from instructions found on one of these blueprints. My system panel, however, skipped all the research. The moment I touched the paper, the information appeared in my head automatically. It was a warehouse blueprint, a first-rank treasure that would let me build a 10-square-meter storage building where eerie corpses could be preserved indefinitely instead of dissolving within 24 hours. That was incredibly valuable. Every corpse I harvested started rotting the moment the creature died, and after a day, it would vanish completely. Materials, crystals, everything gone. A preservation warehouse would let me stockpile bodies, save them for strategic planting, accumulate building materials without racing the clock. The problem, as always, was space. My territory was only 30 square meters. Between the altar, the tent, 2 fields, and the actual ground my creatures needed to stand and fight on, there was no room for a 10-square-meter warehouse. I'd have to upgrade the territory first. I folded the blueprint carefully and tucked it into my pouch, then pulled out my knife and got to work on the real prize, the crystals inside the first-rank Erie's body. First-rank crystals were substantially larger and more potent than the fragments I'd been scraping out of zero-rank skulls. I cut through the black-red flesh and found the first one quickly, glowing with cold energy near what used to be the creature's brain. Then a second one deeper in the torso, a third near the spine. When I pulled out the fourth full-sized first-rank crystal, I actually sat back on my heels and stared at my hand in disbelief. For crystals from a single creature, regular first-rank Eries at the early stage would have 1, maybe 2. This thing had been late stage or even peak first rank, far stronger than I'd initially estimated. No wonder it had demolished my entire army without breaking a sweat. My creatures hadn't lost because they were weak. They'd lost because they'd been fighting something that was practically ready to evolve to second rank. The thought of planting this creature's body in my field made my heart pound. If a regular bone dog corpse produced a useful combat pet, and a first-rank knight's body produced Roya at 498 combat value, what would a peak first-rank Erie become? The possibilities made my head spin. But reality brought me back down quickly. I looked around my cramped, blood-soaked territory and knew I couldn't plant anything this large right now. Both fields were occupied, and even if they weren't, growing another first-rank creature would take most of a day and require resources I didn't have yet. First priority had to be upgrading the territory itself. I checked the Lord's Fire upgrade requirements. The building condition was already met. My creepy bone tent counted as a structure. The crystal cost was the remaining barrier. I dug through the rest of the dead bodies scattered around the territory and collected 15 more crystal fragments, then opened the upgrade panel. The system required me to feed everything into the fire at once. I grabbed the 4 first-rank crystals and 8 fragments, walked to the altar, and threw them all in together. The flame flared, the altar hummed with energy, and the panel confirmed. Lord's Fire upgraded to candle level 2. Then came the choice. 3 options appeared, each offering a 20% bonus in a different direction. Option 1 would increase the fire's suppressive power against Eries. Option 2 would expand the territory's protected area. Option 3 would reduce daily crystal fuel consumption. I stared at the options. The suppression boost was tempting. Making the fire hurt monsters more would help in every fight. The fuel reduction was practical. Every crystal saved was a crystal I could spend elsewhere. But the area expansion was what I needed most desperately. 30 square meters had been choking me since the first night. My creatures couldn't maneuver. I couldn't build new structures. I couldn't even plant large bodies without running out of floor space. 20% more area meant 6 additional square meters, which didn't sound like much in absolute terms, but would make a meaningful difference in combat formations and building placement. More importantly, area was the foundation everything else depended on. More space meant more room for soldiers, which meant more kills, which meant more crystals, which meant faster upgrades, which meant even more space. It was the multiplier that made everything else grow faster. Suppression and fuel efficiency were nice, but they didn't unlock new capabilities the way raw territory did. I knew what I was going to pick, but I took a moment to savor the fact that I was making this choice at all. For days ago, I'd been thrown onto this wasteland with 5 low-grade crystals and a fire seed, expected to die before the first sunrise. Now I had a skeleton knight, a bone horse, a growing army of mutated creatures, a supply stockpile, a rare blueprint, and I was choosing upgrade paths for my expanding territory. The people who sent me here wanted me to disappear quietly into the darkness. Instead, I was building something in it. And every night that passed, it got a little bigger, a little stronger, a little harder to ignore. I reached for the panel and made my choice. I chose the area expansion without hesitation. 3 seconds of thinking was all it took. Roya had just proven he could handle anything at the first rank level, so I didn't need more suppressive power from the fire right now. Reducing fuel costs was tempting. Every crystal saved meant one more I could invest elsewhere. But saving money doesn't help when your biggest problem is that you're trying to run a military operation inside a space the size of a large bedroom. 30 square meters had been strangling me since day one. Every fight turned into a cramped brawl where my creatures tripped over each other. I couldn't build the warehouse from the blueprint I'd just found. I couldn't plant large creatures without blocking the walkways between the fields and the altar. More space was the foundation that everything else would be built on, and foundations come first. The moment I confirmed the choice, the Lord's fire reacted like a living thing. The flames surged upward from fist size to something I could barely wrap both arms around, and the color deepened from pale washed-out yellow to something richer and more substantial. But the real show was the light circle. The boundary of my protected zone, that thin line between survival and the hungry dark, rushed outward in every direction like a shockwave. 6 meters across became nearly 10. The area more than doubled to 80 square meters, and everything that had been lurking just outside my old perimeter was suddenly caught inside the new one. The sight nearly made me gag. I'd known intellectually that there were a lot of Eries pressed up against my border every night. I'd heard them constantly, the hissing, the scratching, the wet sounds of bodies pushing against each other in the dark. But seeing them all at once, exposed by the expanding firelight, was something else entirely. Dozens upon dozens of creatures packed shoulder to shoulder in a ring around where my old boundary had been. Crawling Eries, bone dogs, monkey corpse Eries, those disgusting meatball things, a whole zoo of nightmares suddenly bathed in light they weren't prepared for. The upgraded fire hit them hard. Candle Level 2 carried far more suppressive force than the previous version, and these zero-rank creatures had no resistance to speak of. Their skin started smoking and bubbling on contact with the light, like someone had doused them in acid. They screamed, a chorus of shrieks and howls that would have frozen my blood a few days ago, and tried to flee back toward the darkness at the new perimeter's edge. I didn't even need to give a verbal order. The thought had barely formed in my mind. Kill them all, when Roya's crimson eyes flashed, and he was already swinging onto the bone horse. He didn't charge recklessly into the mass of panicking creatures the way my Eries would have. Instead, he guided the horse along the edge of the new territory in a wide, sweeping circle, sword extended, and simply harvested everything in his path. It was methodical and almost elegant in a grotesque sort of way. Each swing of that death energy-coated blade cut through 3 or 4 creatures at once, sending limbs and chunks of black flesh flying. The bone horse's hooves crushed anything that fell beneath them without breaking stride. Roya moved through the trapped Eries the way a farmer moves through a wheat field, steady, unhurried, thorough. A first-rank peak knight with a death aspect weapon, supported by the Lord's fire suppression field, against dozens of zero-rank creatures who were already burning from the inside out. It wasn't a fight. It was pest control. The fire was paying a price for suppressing this many creatures at once, though. I watched the flames start flickering and dimming as it burned through crystal energy at an alarming rate, so I threw in every fragment I had on me to keep it stable. A necessary cost. The harvest from these bodies would repay it many times over. Within minutes it was done. A handful of lucky creatures had managed to scramble past Roya and escape into the darkness beyond the new perimeter, but the vast majority lay dead across the freshly expanded territory. The ground was carpeted in black blood and scattered remains. Roya's bone horse picked its way through the carnage with delicate steps, its blue fire hooves leaving scorch marks on the gore-soaked earth. I tossed my knife to Roya and told him to start extracting crystals from the bodies. He ignored the knife entirely. Instead, he walked to the nearest corpse, shoved his armored hand straight into its skull like he was reaching into a bag, rooted around for a second, and pulled out a crystal fragment dripping with slime. Then he moved to the next one and did it again. No tools needed. Just raw strength and zero squeamishness. I decided to leave him to it. While Roya worked, I opened my territory panel and took in the new numbers. 80 square meters of protected space, more than double what I'd had before. The fire's daily fuel requirement had increased to 2 first-rank crystals per 24 hours, which was steeper, but the territory was now generating far more resources than it consumed. My building inventory still only showed the one tent, and I'd need a second unique structure to meet the next upgrade requirement. The real eye-opener was the resource count at the bottom of the panel. 47 relatively intact, crawling, eerie corpses. 11 bone dogs. 5 monkey corpse eries. 3 meatball eries. More raw material than I'd accumulated in all my previous days combined, harvested in a single lucky expansion. I renamed the territory. Sea Wind Territory had been the default label, and it carried the stink of the place the kingdom had thrown me to die. From now on, this was Eternal Territory, a name that meant something to me. In a world of endless night, I was building something that would last. The panel updated instantly. With the administrative details handled, I dragged the 2 halves of the first-rank crawling eerie to the first field. The body had been split clean down the middle by Roya's technique, but the field didn't seem to care about the unconventional presentation. The soil opened up and swallowed both pieces eagerly, and a dark green-black seedling pushed through the surface. For leaves, just like Roya's planting. This was a first-rank creature, and the system treated it with corresponding respect. The growth options were different this time, though. 20 hours to mature, slightly faster than Roya's base time. Probably because it was an eerie rather than a transformed human knight. The first leaf offered the standard acceleration for 2 first-rank crystals. The second leaf was interesting. If the creature matured during the eternal night rather than daylight, its combat power would increase dramatically. The third leaf was completely new. I could feed additional corpses into the field as fertilizer, up to 20 bodies, each one adding a small boost to the final product's strength. The fourth leaf made me laugh out loud after the gymnastics incident. This time, instead of doing calisthenics, I had to recite a poem to the field. The reward was a random passive skill for the creature. After the mortification of bouncing around doing children's exercises in front of my undead army, standing still and reading poetry felt like getting away with robbery. I did the math quickly. 20 hours from now would land the maturation right in the middle of tomorrow's eternal night, which perfectly satisfied the second leaf's condition. There was no reason to waste 2 precious first-rank crystals on acceleration when patience would give me a better result for free. I'd save those crystals for upgrades or emergencies. The third leaf was practically free. I had more corpses than I knew what to do with. I ordered the recovering mutated eries to drag 20 crystal-extracted bodies to the field, and the soil devoured them one by one without complaint. 20 meals for whatever was growing down there, each one adding a little extra to its final form. For the poem, I chose a short war verse I'd learned during my noble education. A traditional knight's charging him meant to steal courage before battle. I straightened my back, faced the field with as much dignity as a blood-splattered teenager standing in a monster graveyard could muster, and recited the words in the formal cadence I'd been taught. Bones for steps, soul fire for guide. The eternal night endures, serving the eternal. The fourth leaf browned and fell. All conditions met except the time-locked night maturation, which would handle itself. By tomorrow night, I'd have a second first-rank creature in my army, one that had been fed 20 extra bodies and would emerge with both enhanced combat stats and a passive ability. I stepped back from the field and surveyed my domain. 80 square meters of blood-soaked ground, lit by an upgraded fire that burned deeper and steadier than before. Roya was methodically cracking skulls and extracting crystals, building a pile of fragments that would fuel operations for days. My surviving mutated eries were feeding on scraps and slowly regenerating their injuries. The bone dog was gnawing on fresh bones, its damaged skeleton already showing signs of repair. Even the armless monkey was dragging itself toward a corpse pile, presumably hoping that eating enough flesh would regrow those massive arms. The panel showed my next upgrade requirements. 10 first-rank crystals, and a second unique building. The crystals would take time to accumulate, but with Roya guarding the territory and the fields churning out soldiers around the clock, every night would be a profitable harvest. The building requirement meant I needed to construct something other than a tent. The warehouse blueprint in my pouch would satisfy that condition perfectly once I gathered the materials. Everything was connecting. The fields produced soldiers. The soldiers killed Eries. The Eries dropped crystals and left corpses. The crystals fueled the fire and funded upgrades. The corpses fed my army and served as planting material for stronger creatures. The upgrades expanded the territory, which gave me room for more fields, more buildings, more soldiers. Each piece of the system fed into the next, creating a cycle that accelerated with every rotation. 5 days ago, I'd been a disgraced noble heir with no combat talent, no allies, and no future, dumped on a barren wasteland by people who wanted me erased from history. Tonight, I had a territory, a name for it, a first-rank champion, a growing army, a supply stockpile, and a creature cooking in my field that would hatch tomorrow into something even more powerful. The people who sent me here, the young king who manufactured my father's downfall, my uncle who stole everything my family built, the nobles who looked the other way while a teenage boy was sentenced to die alone in the dark. They thought they'd buried me. They thought the sea-wind plains would swallow me silently, and they'd never have to think about me again. They were wrong. Every night on these plains made me stronger. Every monster I killed, every crystal I harvested, every creature I grew from that black soil added another brick to the fortress I was building in the place they'd chosen for. My grave. And one day, not today, not tomorrow, but one day soon enough that they should already be losing sleep over it, I would ride out of this wasteland, on a tide of bone and death and fire, and I would remind every single one of them what happens when you try to bury someone who refuses to stay underground. But that was future business. Right now, I had crystals to count, wounds to heal, and a territory to fortify before the next sunset. I pulled out a strip of dried meat, chewed it slowly, and watched Roya work under the steady glow of my upgraded fire. The night was still dark and full of monsters outside my little circle of light, but inside it, for the first time, the monsters worked for me. The poem worked. The fourth leaf browned and dropped the moment I finished reciting, and the seedling in the first field swelled a little taller. 2 conditions left on that planting: the time-locked night maturation and the natural growth clock, both of which would handle themselves without any input from me. By tomorrow night, whatever crawled out of that soil would be something formidable. A first-rank creature grown from a peak-level Eerie corpse, fattened on 20 extra bodies, and carrying a passive skill earned by war poetry. I could wait. I turned my attention to the second field. Among the mountain of corpses scattered across my newly expanded territory, I found a fresh monkey corpse Eerie, one that had died recently enough to qualify for the 3-hour death window that triggered the arm mutation. I tossed it into the soil along with 2 crystal fragments to speed things up. The monkey I already had was invaluable. Its strength, its limited intelligence, its ability to manage the production line without constant babysitting. Having a second one would double my harvesting efficiency during the eternal night. More pullers meant more kills meant more crystals, and more crystals meant faster growth in every direction. With both fields loaded and cooking, I grabbed my knife and joined Roya in the grim business of gutting dead monsters for their crystals. There's no graceful way to describe it. You kneel in black blood, cut open a skull, feel around in cold gray tissue until your fingers close on something hard and smooth. Pull it out, wipe it on your pants, and move to the next body. Repeat. For hours. The smell stopped bothering me somewhere around the 15th corpse, or maybe my nose just gave up. Either way, I worked through the pile with the mechanical focus of someone who understood that every fragment was currency, fuel, and ammunition all rolled into one tiny gray stone. Dawn arrived the way it always did, a white crack splitting the black sky down the middle, expanding violently until the darkness shattered and that cold, colorless daylight poured across the plains. I straightened up from the last corpse and stretched my aching back, looking around at the territory I now called home. It was a horror show. 80 square meters of ground painted in dried black blood, scattered with chunks of flesh, broken bones, and the deflated remains of creatures I'd already emptied of crystals. The stench was thick enough to taste. Any normal person would have vomited and run. But I'd stopped being a normal person about 4 days ago, somewhere between the first time I stuck my hand inside a monster's brain and the moment I started evaluating corpse freshness like a butcher inspecting meat. The sea wind planes had a way of stripping away everything unnecessary and leaving only what was useful. Disgust was not useful. Efficiency was. Roya stood motionless beside the last body, having worked through the entire night without pause or complaint. He didn't breathe, didn't tire, didn't need breaks. When the final crystal fragment clinked into the leather pouch, he simply stopped and waited for new orders, standing perfectly still like a suit of armor on display in a castle hallway. The difference between him and my other creatures was staggering. The mutated Iris were tools, effective but mindless, requiring constant direction. Roya was a soldier. He understood tasks, completed them independently, and reported back through that strange mental link we shared. Having him felt less like commanding a monster and more like having a very quiet, very deadly lieutenant. I lifted the leather pouch and nearly dropped it from the weight. The thing was swollen to bursting, stuffed so full that the seams were straining. I counted the contents carefully, twice, because the first number seemed too good to be true. 107 crystal fragments. I let that sink in. When I'd arrived on these plains 5 days ago, I had 5 low-grade crystals to my name and no way to get more. 5 crystals that weren't even enough to keep the Lord's fire burning for a single day. Now I was holding the equivalent of more than 13 first-rank crystals, earned in a single night's harvest thanks to the territory expansion catching dozens of monsters inside the new perimeter. The wealth gap between yesterday and today was so enormous it felt almost fictional, like I'd stumbled into a different story entirely. I told Roya to absorb the dark energy from the leftover corpses, the ones I'd already stripped of crystals. He could strengthen himself by draining the residual eerie essence from dead flesh, and those bodies would dissolve by tomorrow anyway. No point wasting them. He bowed slightly and got to work, pressing his armored palm against each corpse and drawing out thin ribbons of black mist that flowed into his body like smoke being inhaled. Every bit of energy he absorbed now was investment in a stronger guardian later. With over 100 fragments in hand, I faced a decision that would shape the next phase of my development. I could pour the crystals into upgrading the Lord's fire again, pushing toward the next level, expanding my territory further, increasing my defensive capabilities. Or I could unlock a third planting field, tripling my production capacity. I chose the field. It took me about 1 second to decide. Territory size was important, but I'd just doubled my space, and it was serving me fine for now. What I lacked was throughput. 2 fields meant 2 products at a time, and with growth cycles running 4 to 6 hours for basic creatures, I was bottlenecked on how many soldiers I could produce per day. A third field would let me run specialized operations. 1 field for combat troops, 1 for utility creatures like the monkey, and 1 for experimental plantings. I'd been wanting to test what happened when I planted crystals themselves, or random objects, or combinations of materials. A dedicated experimental field would let me explore without sacrificing my military production schedule. I opened the unlock panel and confirmed. 80 crystal fragments vanished into gray smoke instantly, a staggering cost that left me feeling physically lighter, like I'd just donated blood. But the third field materialized in my vision as a dark square waiting to be placed, and I dragged it into position beside the other 2, forming a curved line around the Lord's fire altar. 3 black patches of soil arranged in an arc, each one a factory capable of turning death into useful life. I threw another monkey corpse eerie body into the new field immediately. 2 crystal fragments for acceleration. Monkeys were my priority right now. Their intelligence and pulling strength made them the engine of my nighttime harvesting operation. Every additional monkey meant more kills per hour during the eternal night, which meant more crystals, which meant faster everything. The Lord's fire was starting to flicker from all the suppression work it had done during the expansion, so I fed it 16 more fragments to stabilize it. That left me with 9 lonely fragments rattling around in my pouch. Over 100 crystals had come and gone in less than an hour. I'd spent them on a field unlock, fire fuel, creature acceleration, and planting materials. It felt like trying to fill a bathtub with a teacup. No matter how much poured in, the demands always outpaced the supply. This territory ate resources the way Iris ate flesh, constantly, hungrily, and never quite satisfied. But complaining about it wouldn't change the math. I moved on to construction. The territory expansion had given me room to build, and I had two projects waiting. First was a simple bone fence, a defensive barrier made from 5 thick, eerie bone rods, planted at the territory's edge with spikes pointing outward. I assembled one section and placed it at the perimeter. It looked menacing enough, about a meter tall and a meter wide, with pale bone spikes jutting outward like teeth. The panel said it could slow down low-rank Eries, forcing them to spend time breaking through before entering the territory. I did some quick geometry in my head. 80 square meters in a rough circle meant a circumference of about 30 meters. At 1 meter per fence section, I'd need 30 of them to ring the entire territory, and each one cost 5 bone rods. 150 bone rods total, which was more raw material than I had available and more production effort than the result justified. These fences were consumable. Eries would smash through them eventually, and I'd have to rebuild constantly. The cost-to-benefit ratio was terrible for full perimeter coverage. Better to use them strategically around critical structures like the altar and the fields, and let Roya handle everything else. The second project was far more important. The warehouse from the blueprint I'd found inside the first-rank Eerie. I ordered the monkey to strip bones from bone dog corpses and peel skin from crawling Eries until I had enough materials. 20 thick bones for the frame, 10 sheets of processed Eerie hide for the walls. The monkey worked fast, those massive regenerated arms ripping apart carcasses with casual efficiency. Its arms had fully regrown during the night, fed enough dead flesh. Apparently, even severed limbs could regenerate completely. That was good to know. It meant my creatures were even more durable than I'd thought, as long as I kept them supplied with food. When the materials were gathered, I activated the blueprint. The warehouse materialized behind the altar, next to my tent. A long black rectangle about 5 meters by 2 meters, built from a skeleton of white bone pillars wrapped in tight-fitting dark hide. No windows, just a single door flap. It looked like a coffin designed by someone who thought coffins should be roomier. But appearances didn't matter. What mattered was the function. Anything stored inside would be preserved indefinitely. No more racing against the 24-hour decay clock. No more watching valuable corpses and materials dissolve into nothing because I couldn't use them fast enough. I ordered the Eries to start loading it immediately. Bone dog bodies and meatball Eerie corpses went in first, the rarer specimens that I'd want for future planting experiments. Regular crawling Eerie bodies I left outside. There were too many of them, and they weren't worth the storage space when I could always get more. Prioritization was becoming second nature. Every decision now filtered through a simple question. Does this make me stronger tomorrow, or is it just comfortable today? With the warehouse built, I'd satisfied the second unique building requirement for the next territory upgrade. Tent plus warehouse equaled 2 distinct structures, combined with 10 first-rank crystals, which I could accumulate over the next couple of nights. I'd be able to push the Lord's fire to its next level. The growth curve was steepening. Each upgrade fed into the next one faster, and each night's harvest was bigger than the last. I sat down cross-legged by the fire to rest and circulate my trainee-level night energy. It wasn't much, a thin trickle of warmth moving through my body like a slow stream, but the practice was important. Combat aura was the foundation of all-night advancement in this world, and even though my natural talent was terrible, consistent training would eventually push me toward the next rank. Probably. Hopefully. At least it kept my muscles from cramping up after hours of crouching over corpses with a knife. While I meditated, I found myself looking at Roya. He stood a few meters away, perfectly still, one hand resting on the pommel of his sword. The crimson light in his eye slits was steady and calm. Not the wild, hungry glow of the Eries, but something more controlled, more aware. A question I'd been carrying since he first knelt before me finally surfaced. Do you still have memories from when you were alive? The words came out before I'd fully decided to ask them. Part of me was genuinely curious. Roya had been a real person once. A trained knight, a sworn soldier of my family, a man who made a choice to betray my father and serve my uncle instead. The creature standing before me now was built from his corpse, but remade by the field into something fundamentally different. Was there anything of the original man left inside that black armor? Did he remember serving the golden wheat household? Did he remember the look on my face when he locked the prison card and told me to be grateful? Did he remember choosing the winning side over the right one? I watched those crimson eyes for any flicker of recognition, any sign that my question had stirred something beneath the obedient surface. The fire crackled softly between us, and the cold wind swept across the plains carrying the fading smell of last night's slaughter, and I waited to see if the dead could remember being alive. I asked Roya if he remembered anything from his life before the field remade him. His answers came back flat and mechanical, like reading from a blank page. No memories, no knowledge of where he came from, no understanding of why he served me. His only directive was absolute loyalty to his lord, me. It was like someone had wiped a computer's hard drive clean and reinstalled nothing but the operating system. He kept his combat instincts, his fighting techniques, and enough adult-level intelligence to understand complex orders and carry them out independently. But everything that had made him Roya the man, his personality, his ambitions, his reasons for betraying my father, all of it was gone, erased completely by the field's transformation process. I tested the boundaries of his obedience by asking increasingly specific questions. Could he strategize? Yes, within the scope of orders given. Would he hesitate if I told him to destroy himself? No. He would drive that sword through his own neck without a flicker of resistance. There was no hidden agenda lurking behind those crimson eyes, no buried loyalty to my uncle or the kingdom that might surface at an inconvenient moment. He was exactly what he appeared to be, a perfectly loyal, emotionally dead killing machine with first-rank peak combat power and room to grow stronger. I couldn't have designed a better soldier if I'd written the specifications myself. The second field finished its cycle while I was still processing all of this, spitting out a fresh, mutated monkey corpse eerie that shook the dirt off its massive arms and dropped to the ground in front of me. I sent the original monkey to the warehouse to retrieve the last monkey corpse I had stored inside. This was where things got interesting. When the monkey dragged the body out and dropped it into the second field, I expected the panel to show the standard options. Instead, the second leaf, the one requiring the creature to have died within 3 hours, was already marked as completed. I stared at it for a confused moment before the implications hit me like a punch to the chest. The warehouse didn't just preserve corpses. It froze their timeline completely. That monkey corpse Eerie had been killed during last night's battle, hours and hours ago. Under normal circumstances, it would have long since passed the 3-hour death window required for the arm mutation bonus. But because I'd stored it in the warehouse immediately after death, the decay clock had been paused entirely. As far as the field was concerned, the creature had died moments ago. The warehouse had effectively given me the ability to stockpile fresh kills indefinitely, pulling them out whenever I needed them and having the field treat them as if they'd just been slain. This changed everything about my resource management strategy. Previously, I'd been racing against the 24-hour dissolution clock on every single corpse, frantically trying to plant or process bodies before they vanished. Now I could store high-value kills, bone dogs, monkeys, anything rare or useful, and save them for the perfect planting conditions. Monkey corpses could be banked and planted whenever I needed more pullers, always qualifying for the arm mutation. Rare creatures I only encountered occasionally could be preserved until I had the right field conditions and leaf requirements to maximize their potential. The warehouse wasn't just a storage building. It was a time capsule that turned every kill into a permanent asset instead of a ticking clock. By tonight, I'd have 4 mutated monkeys working the perimeter, 4 sets of those massive arms reaching into the darkness, dragging in prey at a rate that would make last night's harvest look like pocket change. The math on crystal income was going to get very favorable very quickly. The third field finished its monkey as well, and I decided to try something different with it. I had a meatball eerie corpse in storage, one of those revolting rolling masses of stitched flesh, and I was curious what the field would do with it. I pulled it out and planted it. The panel showed 6 hours to mature, which was longer than the basic creatures. But the second leaf caught my attention immediately. It didn't ask for a crystal fragment or a time condition. It wanted a sacrifice, a living creature fed into the field alongside the planted corpse, whose characteristics would be absorbed and merged into the final product. I looked around my territory and did a quick cost-benefit analysis. My bone dogs were too valuable as mounts and tanks. The monkeys were irreplaceable utility creatures. That left the mutated crawling Eries, solid fighters, but I had the most of them and they were the easiest to replace. Functionally, they were my most expendable unit type. I called one over. It crawled to the edge of the field without hesitation, and the soil consumed it in seconds, reducing it to a wisp of gray smoke. The sacrifice leaf dropped. I added 2 crystal fragments to trigger the acceleration leaf as well, then stepped back to let the field work. Whatever grew from a meatball Eerie merged with a crawling Erie's combat traits would be something I'd never seen before. The experimentation was half the fun of this system. Every new combination was a roll of the dice that could produce something useless or something game-changing. With all 3 fields occupied in processing, I had some downtime. Real downtime, for once. Not the desperate kind where I collapsed from exhaustion, but the deliberate kind where I could actually choose what to focus on. And what I chose was curiosity. I'd been wanting to test the fields with non-combat items ever since I first grew explosive stones from ordinary rocks. The panel had said I could plant anything, and I'd taken that claim at face value with rocks and corpses, but I'd never explored what happened with everyday objects. Now, with 3 monkeys handling the production line and Roy as standing guard, I had the freedom to experiment. I started with a crystal fragment. The result was fascinating. The field would produce a tiny fraction of a crystal every 24 hours, essentially generating interest on my deposit. About 10% daily return. For a noble lord with a large crystal reserve, this would be an incredible investment tool. Plant a fortune, harvest steady passive income forever. But for me, with my meager reserves and desperate need for immediate returns, tying up a field and a crystal for such a slow drip wasn't worth it. I filed the information away for later. Someday, when I had enough fields and enough capital, I'd dedicate one entirely to crystal farming. A bank made of monster dirt. The idea appealed to the part of me that still thought like a nobleman managing an estate. I pulled the crystal out and tried other things. A strip of dried meat went in and came out as a piece of magical jerky covered in strange patterns. Eating it would restore energy of any type, night aura, dark essence, even magical power. A universal recovery food. Not exactly a battlefield weapon, but extremely useful for keeping my creatures and eventually myself topped off during long fights. A linen shirt produced a cloth garment with a faint defensive enchantment. Barely useful in combat, but proof that the field could enhance mundane objects with protective properties. Given better base materials, actual armor, quality fabric, forged metal, the results might be significantly more impressive. Then I planted a piece of black bread. What grew out of the soil made me question the field's sense of humor. It was still shaped exactly like a loaf of black bread, but it had hardened into something with the density and weight of an iron bar. The panel called it a black bread club. Hit an Eerie in the head with it, and there was a chance of stunning them. I swung it experimentally. It had decent heft. I shook my head and set it aside. A bread-shaped bludgeon wasn't going to win any wars, but it was technically better than the knives I'd been carrying, at least for stunning purposes. Then my hand drifted to my chest, and my fingers closed around the pendant hanging there. My mother's pendant. The small black stone shaped like a pigeon's egg, cold and smooth. The only thing she'd left me before she died. I'd been carrying it since childhood, and the soldiers who stripped me of everything else had let me keep it because it showed no magical properties whatsoever. Just a sentimental trinket. A dead woman's keepsake for her abandoned son. The thought appeared in my mind, and I couldn't push it away. What if I planted it? Every logical argument said not to. It was my only connection to my mother. It had no magical value. It would probably just produce some slightly enhanced version of a decorative stone, and I'd have wasted field time on nostalgia. But the field had surprised me with every single thing I'd ever put into it. Plain rocks became grenades. Dead monsters became loyal soldiers. Bread became weapons. What would it make of something that had been carried close to a person's heart for 18 years? I told myself I could always dig it back out if the results were disappointing. The field allowed cancellation. I'd done it before with the crystal and with Roy's finger. No permanent risk. I unclasped the chain, held the pendant over the center of the second field, and let it drop into the dark soil. The reaction was immediate and violent. There was no gentle sprouting, no slow absorption. The ground shook hard enough to make me stagger. A deep vibration rolled through the earth beneath my feet, resonating up through my legs and into my chest like a second heartbeat. The soil around the pendant churned with a ferocity I'd never seen. Not the lazy, swallowing motion it used for corpses, but a frenzied consuming, as if the field itself was excited by what it had been given. A tree exploded out of the ground. Not a seedling, not a sprout. A full tree trunk erupted from the soil and shot upward, passing my height in less than a second and continuing to grow. Thick branches burst from the trunk in every direction, each one terminating in a single leaf so black it seemed to absorb the light around it. The whole thing happened so fast I barely had time to stumble backward before the lowest branches were at eye level. I stood there with my mouth open, staring up at a tree that had no business existing. It was taller than me, planted in a 1-meter square of magic dirt, in the middle of a barren wasteland where nothing had grown naturally in decades. Its branches spread wide, each one holding a single ink-black leaf that seemed to pulse with a faint internal energy. I counted the leaves. 16. Every single branch held exactly 1 leaf, and there were 16 of them. Nothing I'd ever planted had produced more than 4 leaves. Most things got 1 or 2. Roya's planting had been exceptional at 4. This pendant, this supposedly worthless trinket with no magical properties, had generated 4 times that number. My hands were shaking as I opened the panel. The words that appeared in my mind made the world tilt sideways. Dead black dragon egg. Maturation time. 3 years. My mother's pendant was a dragon egg. A dead one. Never hatched, never alive, but unmistakably draconic in origin. And the field, which could turn rocks into grenades and corpses into knights, had looked at this dead egg and decided it could grow a dragon from it. The 16 leaves each listed a condition for enhancing the final creature. I read through them with increasing disbelief. The first leaf wanted a 7th-rank crystal, a resource so far beyond my current reach that it might as well have been asking for a piece of the sun. The second wanted me to conquer 3 noble territories and make them submit as vassals. The third demanded the sacrifice of a 7th-rank creature's corpse, with a conversion option allowing lower-ranked substitutes at a 10-to-1 ratio. The fourth required expanding my territory's diameter to over 1,000 meters. Then they got strange. One leaf wanted me to confess romantic feelings to a duke-level noblewoman face-to-face. Another required me to make a stoic sky knight lose his composure and start cursing. The final leaf, number 16, demanded the corpse of a king. Half of these conditions were militarily impossible at my current strength. The other half were socially absurd. And the base maturation time was 3 years even before any acceleration. But beneath the shock and the absurdity, a deeper realization was settling into my bones. My mother hadn't left me a worthless keepsake. She'd left me a dragon. A black dragon, specifically, a color I'd never heard associated with any kingdom's dragon lineage. The eagle-eyed ducal family, my mother's people, were powerful enough that even the Blaze Kingdom's king feared provoking them. But dragons? No one had mentioned dragons. Where had she obtained a dead dragon egg? Why had she given it to her infant son disguised as a pendant? What else about her past had been hidden from me? The questions multiplied faster than I could process them, each one branching into 3 more. My mother's early death, the severed connection between my father and the Eagle-Eye family, the strange circumstances that led to my exile. Threads I'd never thought to connect were suddenly vibrating with the suggestion of a larger pattern. I forced myself to stop spinning. None of these mysteries could be solved standing in a field full of monster corpses on a forgotten wasteland. What I could do was make a practical decision about the dragon egg, and the practical decision was obvious. Pull it out and wait. 3 years was too long to occupy a field. I had 3 planting plots and desperately needed every one of them for immediate military production. Tying one up for 36 months on a project whose enhancement conditions included conquering territories and killing kings was a luxury I couldn't remotely afford. But the egg wasn't going anywhere. Once I'd expanded enough to have 4, 5, maybe 6 fields, I could dedicate one permanently to the dragon and start chipping away at those 16 leaves one by one. I reached into the soil and carefully extracted the pendant. The tree vanished instantly, collapsing back into the earth as if it had never existed. The pendant sat in my palm, cool and dark and ordinary-looking, keeping its impossible secret. I hung it back around my neck and tucked it under my shirt, pressing it against my chest where it had always rested. The weight of it felt different now. Not heavier, more significant. like holding a loaded weapon instead of an empty one. Somewhere in my bloodline, on my mother's side, there was a connection to black dragons that nobody had told me about. And somewhere in my future, if I survived long enough and grew strong enough, I was going to hatch one. But that was a problem for the version of me who commanded armies and conquered territories. The current version of me had fields to manage, crystals to collect, and a first-rank Eerie growing in the soil that would emerge tomorrow night as the second pillar of my military force. Dragons could wait. The eternal night wouldn't. I turned back to the fields and got to work. I put the dragon egg back around my neck and tried to pretend the last 5 minutes hadn't just rewritten everything I thought I knew about my mother. Hey, dead black dragon egg disguised as a worthless pendant, hanging against my chest for 18 years without anyone, including me, having the faintest idea what it really was. The field had seen through the disguise instantly, of course. That strange system in my head didn't care about appearances. It looked at objects and saw what they truly were, stripped of pretense and packaging. But 3 years of maturation time and 16 enhancement conditions that included conquering noble territories, confessing love to duchesses, making Sky Knight's curse, and feeding the field a king's corpse. None of that was remotely possible for a trainee knight squatting on 80 square meters of blood-soaked dirt at the edge of civilization. The dragon would have to wait. I needed fields for soldiers, not 3-year science projects with requirements pulled from a lunatic's wish list. I tucked the pendant deep under my shirt where it would stay hidden. Something this valuable, this impossibly, world-shakingly valuable, couldn't be shown to anyone. If word got out that the exiled son of the Golden Wheat family was sitting on a dragon egg, every power player on the continent would send armies to take it. I'd gone from being too insignificant to kill to being too dangerous to leave alive, and the only thing protecting me was the fact that nobody knew. With the dragon shelved, I got back to the business of building my army. I had meatball Eerie corpses stored in the warehouse and a theory I wanted to test. The first mutated meatball, the clawball I'd grown by sacrificing a crawling Eerie, was still hours from hatching, but I already liked the concept enough to double down. I pulled the second meatball body from storage, planted it in the second field, and sacrificed another mutated Eerie to trigger the fusion leaf. 2 more crystal fragments went in for acceleration. That left me with 3 crystal fragments and 1 lonely mutated Eerie. My reserves had gone from over 100 fragments to nearly nothing in the span of a single day. The cycle of this place was becoming painfully familiar. Harvest a fortune during the night, spend it all before noon, start the next evening nearly broke. Every crystal I earned got immediately reinvested into troops, fire fuel, field unlocks, or building materials. The territory was a hungry machine that consumed resources faster than I could shovel them in, always demanding more, always growing just enough to need even more than before. I ate lunch sitting cross-legged by the fire, half a brick of black bread soaked in water until it was soft enough to chew without cracking a tooth, plus a strip of the magical jerky I'd grown in the field earlier. The enhanced meat was genuinely useful. When I bit into it, a warm current of energy flowed down my throat and spread through my entire body, feeding my night aura like adding kindling to a small flame. The sensation was subtle but unmistakable. My trainee-level combat energy, which normally sat in my core like a lukewarm puddle, actually circulated a little faster after eating. Not enough to matter in a real fight, but enough to prove that the field could create food with genuine restorative properties. If I could grow enough of this stuff, I could potentially accelerate my own cultivation simply by eating regularly. Another project for the future, filed alongside crystal banking and dragon hatching in the growing cabinet of things I'll do when I have more fields. After eating, I spent the next few hours practicing the basic combat aura techniques I'd learned at the Night Academy back in the Golden Wheat territory. Breathing exercises, energy circulation patterns, the fundamental movements of channeling power through the body's meridian pathways. My talent in this area was genuinely terrible. I'd been the worst student in my class by a significant margin, which was part of why nobody had bothered fighting for my inheritance rights. A Marquis heir who couldn't even reach iron rank was a political embarrassment, regardless of bloodline. But talent wasn't everything. Consistency mattered too, especially when the alternative to getting stronger was dying in the dark. I went through the forms with mechanical precision, sweating in the cold wind, feeling the tiny thread of energy inside me pulse a fraction brighter with each repetition. It was like trying to fill an ocean with an eyedropper, but I'd rather have an eyedropper than nothing. The third field interrupted my training by producing its first clawball eerie. The thing that crawled out of the soil was one of the most disturbing creatures I'd ever seen, and I'd spent the past week surrounded by nightmare fuel. Imagine a boulder-sized ball of compressed flesh, roughly a meter across, with over a dozen crawling eerie claws jutting out in every direction like the spines of a sea urchin. No head, no eyes, no discernible front or back. Just a rolling mass of meat bristling with razor-sharp bone blades that carved deep gouges into the ground as it moved. It rolled up to me and scraped its claws against the dirt in what I'd come to recognize as the universal gesture of monster submission. The sound it made was like dragging a handful of knives across a stone floor. I pulled up its panel. 0 rank peak, combat value 99, the highest of any 0 rank creature I'd produced. The description called it a weapon of war, born to kill, capable of tearing through same-rank defenses at high speed during a charge. A battlefield cleaner. I liked it immediately. Not as a pet. Nothing about this thing was remotely lovable, but as a tactical asset. My army had been heavy on individual fighters, but lacked any kind of area denial or charge-breaking capability. A ball of spinning blades rolling through a crowd of enemies at full speed would shred everything in its path. 3 of these things working together could clear a perimeter faster than a dozen mutated Eries. I ordered the monkey to plant the last meatball corpse with another eerie sacrifice, burning through my final reserves. When it was done, I had exactly 1 mutated Eerie, 1 crystal fragment, and the growing certainty that tonight's eternal night would need to be extremely productive if I wanted to keep this operation running. By sunset, I'd accumulated 3 clawball Eries, each one a bristling sphere of death rolling around the territory like tumbleweeds from hell. The 2 remaining fields held bone dog corpses that would mature during the night without acceleration. No crystals left to speed them up. My total forces now included Roya the skeleton knight on his bone horse, 1 2-headed bone dog. For mutated monkeys, 3 clawballs, 1 surviving mutated Eerie, and whatever the first-rank crawling Eerie growing in the first field would become when it hatched later tonight. Not a huge army by any standard, but significantly more diverse and powerful than the pure Eerie swarm I'd been running before. The orange light of sunset was painting the western sky when I noticed movement on the plains. A figure was running toward my territory from the direction of the distant mountain range, stumbling, tripping, clearly exhausted, but moving with the desperate energy of someone who knew that darkness was minutes away and being caught outside meant death. My hand went to the knife at my belt automatically. Humans were supposed to be extinct in this part of the Sea-Wind Plains. No trade routes, no settlements, no reason for anyone to be here. The last humans I'd encountered had been the escort squad, and they were all dead. As the figure got closer, I could make out details. A middle-aged man, stocky build, wearing torn leather armor. No weapons visible. He was running flat out toward the glow of my lord's fire like a moth to a lamp. Then he spotted Roya standing at the edge of the territory like a black iron statue, and his face lit up with wild joy. "Captain Roya, it's really you." The recognition faded quickly when he noticed the rest of my territory's residents. The clawballs, the monkeys, the Eerie perched near the field. His skin went pale. But then his eyes found me, and the relief that flooded his face was almost theatrical in its intensity. "Young master, you're alive. Thank the gods." I studied him for a moment, searching my memories. Novak, one of the lower-ranking soldiers in Roya's escort squad. Not a knight, just a common fighter, probably iron rank at best. I remembered him vaguely from the prison cart journey, a background face among the men who'd been shipping me to my death. "Should I be dead?" I asked, keeping my voice flat and my expression neutral. I didn't move from my position near the fire. He was still standing outside the light circle, and I was in no hurry to invite him in. Novak launched into his story between gasping breaths. The escort squad's camp had been hit by magical beasts, the same silver wolves I'd encountered, most likely. The group scattered. He'd gotten lucky and stumbled across a baron's territory somewhere on the plains, where he'd sheltered for a few days. Today he'd gone out exploring, gotten lost, and wandered here by sheer chance. He was laying it on thick, the gratitude, the loyalty, the chest-thumping declarations of eternal service to the golden wheat bloodline. He called me, young master, and great lord, in alternating sentences, his eyes darting between me and the increasingly dark sky with barely concealed panic. The eternal night was minutes away, and he knew exactly what that meant for someone standing in the open without a lord's fire. "Let me serve you again," he pleaded, practically vibrating with urgency. "I was always loyal to the Golden Wheat family, and there's a baron's territory nearby, just 2 hours in that direction. I can take you there tomorrow. But please, the night is coming. Let me inside your territory." I let him talk. I watched his face, his hands, the way his eyes moved. I'd grown up in a noble household where political maneuvering was a daily sport, and even as a child with no talent for combat, I'd learned to read people. Fear was genuine. The approaching darkness would terrify anyone without shelter. Gratitude seemed real enough on the surface. The loyalty claims were standard, desperate flattery from a man who needed something. But something didn't fit. I let the silence stretch for a beat, then asked the question that had been forming in my mind since he started talking. "You just told me you got lost. But now you're pointing in a specific direction and telling me the Baron's territory is exactly 2 hours that way." I tilted my head slightly. "Which is it, Novak? Are you lost? Or do you know exactly where you are?" The look on his face when those words landed was worth more than 100 crystal fragments. It was brief, just a flicker, a micro-expression that lasted half a heartbeat. But I caught it. Surprise, followed by something harder to name. Not guilt exactly, but the recognition of a man who'd just realized his story had a hole in it, and the person listening was sharper than expected. The sky above us was darkening fast. In minutes, the eternal night would fall, and every creature on these plains would either be behind a lord's fire or dead. Novak needed my protection to survive the next 12 hours. That gave me leverage. And in my current situation, alone, exiled, surrounded by enemies both human and monstrous, leverage over another person was a resource I couldn't afford to waste. I didn't invite him in yet. I stood there in the fading light, arms crossed, and waited to see what story he'd come up with next. The truth, a better lie, or something in between. Whatever he chose would tell me exactly what kind of man I was dealing with, and whether the word loyal in his vocabulary meant the same thing it meant in mine. Novak's face froze when I pointed out the contradiction in his story. He'd claimed to be lost, then immediately pointed in a specific direction and quoted an exact travel time to the Baron's territory. A real lost person doesn't do that. His eyes flickered, just for an instant, and I saw something behind them that wasn't quite human. Not fear, not guilt. Something emptier. He tried to recover. "I just remembered," he blurted out, forcing a laugh that sounded like it had been rehearsed by someone who'd watched humans laugh, but never understood why they did it. I shook my head. Boring. The word was barely out of my mouth before the thought formed in my mind. Kill him. And before I could even finish thinking it, Roya was already moving. That was the terrifying beauty of the mental link between us. He didn't need verbal orders. He could feel my intent the moment it crystallized, and his response time was essentially 0. 1 second the skeleton knight was standing motionless beside me like a decorative suit of armor. The next he was a black blur crossing the light boundary faster than my eyes could track. Novak's smile was still hanging on his face when the death energy-coated sword took his head off. Clean, precise, instantaneous. The head tumbled through the air and hit the ground, and then the truly disturbing part happened. Instead of blood spraying from the neck stump, the entire body started melting. The skin turned waxy and white, the limbs stretched like pulled taffy, and the face that had been twisted in terror a moment ago, smoothed out into a blank, featureless oval. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a pale flat surface where a human face had been pretending to exist. A fake human Eerie. One of the most feared types of living Eerie in this world. These creatures consumed living humans, absorbed their memories, copied their appearance, and walked around in broad daylight wearing a dead person's face. They could infiltrate merchant caravans, military units, even noble families, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Every lord's worst nightmare was discovering that someone they trusted, a servant, a guard, a spouse, had been replaced by one of these things. Roya dragged the melting corpse back inside the territory and dumped it unceremoniously on the ground. I looked down at the shapeless white body and felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. The truth was, I'd been suspicious from the moment Novak opened his mouth. The story had too many holes: the convenient timing, the excessive flattery, the way he'd called Roya by his captain's title as if he recognized him, despite Roya being completely transformed into a black-armored skeleton. Knight that looked nothing like the man he'd been in life. A real member of the escort squad would have screamed at the sight of what Roya had become, not greeted him like an old friend. But here's the part one didn't say out loud. The part that made me realize how much this wasteland had already changed me. Even if Novak had been real, I would have killed him anyway. I wasn't being cruel. I was being practical. A living human inside my territory was a liability I couldn't afford. They needed food and water from my limited supplies. They needed sleep, which meant I'd have to guard them. They could panic during an attack, get in the way, make mistakes that cost me creatures or crystals. And worst of all, they could leave. A living person could walk out of my territory, travel to another noble's domain, and tell them everything they'd seen. The fields, the planting system, the skeleton knight, the dragon egg pendant. Information about my capabilities was a weapon that could be used against me, and I couldn't risk it reaching the ears of my uncle, the king, or any other noble who might see me as a threat worth eliminating more thoroughly. My territory needed corpses, not companions. Dead things were reliable. Dead things didn't betray you, didn't gossip, didn't have agendas. Every creature in my army existed to serve a single purpose, and none of them would ever decide that purpose wasn't worth serving anymore. After what happened with my father, betrayed by his own brother, abandoned by knights he'd trained, condemned by a king he'd protected, I had zero interest in trusting living humans with anything. The fake Novak was proof that the world agreed with my philosophy. Even the monsters were trying to infiltrate my territory by pretending to be people. The only safe policy was to treat every stranger as a threat until they were safely dead and planted in a field. What bothered me more than the fake human Eerie itself was the implication of its existence. Roya's escort squad had been 7 people. Roya had been turned into a wandering living Eerie by a soul-type creature. Now one of his soldiers had apparently been consumed and replaced by a fake human Eerie. 2 members of the same small squad, both transformed into different types of living Eerie. That was extremely unusual. Under normal circumstances, a single squad encountering even one living Eerie transformation would be considered catastrophically unlucky. 2 suggested that something extraordinary had happened on the night the camp was destroyed. Not just a magical beast attack, not just a Lord's Fire failure, something that attracted or generated an abnormally high concentration of powerful Eerie activity. I filed the question away. It was worth investigating eventually, but not tonight. Tonight was for harvesting. The eternal night dropped like a guillotine blade. One instant the last traces of orange sunset were painting the western sky. The next everything was black. That absolute, pressurized darkness that felt like being buried alive in solid ink. The Lord's Fire flared in response, its upgraded flame pushing back the dark across a full 10 meters of diameter. 80 square meters of protected ground, bright and warm and stable. Compared to the pathetic 30-meter circle I'd been cowering in just 2 nights ago, this felt like a fortress. And the darkness responded in kind. The expanded territory meant a longer perimeter, which meant more surface area touching the boundary between light and dark, which meant more Eries pressing against the edge trying to find a way in. The hissing and scraping that erupted from every direction was louder than anything I'd heard before. Not just dozens of creatures, but what sounded like hundreds, a living ocean of dark things surging against the walls of my little island. I smiled. More monsters meant more crystals. More crystals meant more growth. They weren't a threat anymore. They were inventory. The slaughterhouse began operations. 4 mutated monkeys took positions at the 4 cardinal points of the territory's edge, each one crouching at the light-dark boundary with those enormous muscular arms ready. They reached into the blackness like fishermen dipping their hands into a river, and every few seconds they hauled out a thrashing creature. Crawling Eries mostly, but bone dogs and monkey corpse Eries too. The monkeys didn't bother with finesse. Grab, pull, twist. Every kill took less than 3 seconds. Grab the neck, yank it into the light, snap the spine. Next, the 3 clawball Eries rolled along the inner perimeter in continuous loops, Their dozens of protruding blades carving trenches in the dirt and carving up any creature that managed to slip past the monkey stations. They moved like circular saws on wheels, covering ground at impressive speed, leaving trails of black blood and shredded flesh behind them. The single surviving mutated Eerie had been assigned guard duty at the warehouse entrance. Not exactly a glamorous posting, but an important one. The warehouse contained preserved corpses and building materials that I couldn't afford to lose. The Eerie crouched in front of the door flap like a slightly dim but extremely violent bouncer, ready to destroy anything that came within arm's reach. The Bone Dogs, my original survivor plus 2 freshly grown ones from tonight's early planting cycle, handled logistics. Each one could carry 2 corpses at a time, one in each mouth, sprinting between the kill zones and the processing area near the altar where Roya and I worked. And work we did. I knelt beside the altar with my knife, splitting skulls and extracting crystal fragments with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. Which, at this point, I practically had. Roya worked beside me, but he didn't bother with a blade. He just shoved his armored hand into each skull, felt around for the crystal, and ripped it out. 5 fingers in, crystal out, toss it in the pouch. His technique had all the elegance of a bear raiding a beehive, but it was twice as fast as my knife work. Your excavation skills would have made you Employee of the Month at any factory back on Earth, I told him. His crimson eyes flickered. The Lord requires efficiency, good attitude. You're promoted. Same job, same pay, new title. The crystals accumulated rapidly. Every few minutes I'd grab a handful and feed them into the fields, keeping the production cycle spinning. The second and third fields churned out 2 new Bone Dogs mid-shift, and I sent them straight into the transport rotation without missing a beat. The territory ran like a machine. Monkeys fishing, clawballs patrolling, Bone Dogs hauling, me and Roya processing. Every role filled, every creature working, 0 downtime. When I had enough breathing room, I planted new things in the freed-up fields. More Bone Dogs went into the second field. They were the backbone of my logistics operation now, and I needed as many as I could get. The crawling Eries had been demoted in my strategic thinking. They were still useful as cheap bodies for sacrifice fodder when the fields demanded living offerings, but their combat value was too low to justify dedicated production. The meta had shifted. Bone Dogs for transport and tanking, monkeys for harvesting, clawballs for perimeter defense. Crawling Eries were spare parts. For the third field, I planted the fake human Erie's corpse. This was the most speculative planting I'd done since the dragon egg. A creature that could copy human appearances and memories was potentially the most strategically valuable thing in my entire operation, not for combat, but for intelligence gathering. If I could grow one that obeyed my commands, I could send it into other noble territories disguised as a traveler, a merchant, a refugee. It could observe their defenses, count their forces, map their layouts, and report back to me. In a world where information was power and I had almost none, a loyal spy who could wear anyone's face was worth more than a dozen skeleton knights. The panel revealed that the fake human Erie was actually a first-rank creature, which surprised me. Roya had killed it so effortlessly that I'd assumed it was 0 rank. But its combat rating must have been heavily weighted towards stealth and deception rather than raw fighting power. Against a first-rank peak skeleton knight optimized for combat, it had been hopelessly outmatched, like pitting a spy against a tank. The growth time was 18 hours, and 3 leaves appeared on the seedling. The first leaf offered standard acceleration for a first-rank crystal. The second leaf wanted a piece of noble women's cosmetics to enhance the creature's ability to impersonate females. I didn't have any cosmetics, and acquiring some on a barren wasteland populated exclusively by monsters seemed unlikely in the near term. The third leaf nearly made me choke. It wanted a person to stand naked beside the field for 10 minutes. No clothing, no equipment, nothing. In exchange, the creature's ability to impersonate males would be enhanced. I stared at the panel for a long moment. Then I turned to Roya. "Can you take off your armor and stand by the field for 10 minutes? He answered without hesitation. "My lord, I would willingly resolve this matter for you. However, my armor has fused with my flesh and bone. It cannot be removed." Of course it couldn't. The field's sense of humor struck again. It had given me a task that required nudity, then made my only humanoid soldier permanently welded into his suit. which meant the only candidate for standing naked in the cold wind next to a plot of monster dirt for 10 minutes was me. I looked at the dark sky overhead. I looked at the clawballs rolling past, trailing gore. I looked at the monkeys ripping heads off creatures at the perimeter. I looked at the pile of crystal-emptied corpses stacked by the altar, leaking black fluid into the dirt I was kneeling in. The gymnastics routine had been embarrassing. This would be humiliating. But humiliation was temporary, and a spy that could perfectly impersonate men was a permanent strategic advantage. Every enhancement I skipped was a capability I'd never get back. The field only offered each leaf's bonus once during the growth period. I decided not to decide yet. The planting had 18 hours to mature. I had time to think about whether the tactical value of enhanced male disguise was worth freezing my bare body in front of an audience of undead monsters who, admittedly, had been ordered not to look last time and would presumably obey again. The night's work continued. The crystal pouch swelled. The fields churned. The bone dogs ran their routes. And somewhere in the first field, buried deep in the black soil, the first-rank crawling eyrie I'd planted yesterday was approaching maturation. In a few more hours, it would emerge, enhanced by 20 sacrificed corpses, blessed by a war poem, shaped by the eternal night's dark energy. My second first-rank creature. Another pillar of the army, I was building one corpse at a time in the middle of nowhere. I chewed on a piece of magical jerky and watched my territory work. The firelight was steady, the operations were smooth, and the crystal income was flowing faster than ever. For one quiet moment between extractions, I let myself feel something close to pride. Not for what I had, a tiny patch of monster-infested dirt on the worst land in the kingdom, but for what I was becoming. 5 days ago, I'd been a helpless boy shivering next to a dying flame. Tonight, I was a lord commanding a specialized kill and harvest operation that would make most established nobles weep with envy. The darkness pressed against my borders, vast and endless and full of things that wanted to eat me. But inside those borders, everything that moved, breathed, or crawled did so because I told it to. And tomorrow, there would be more of them. And the day after that, even more. The eternal night had been meant as my execution. Instead, it had become my factory floor. I ended up doing the naked thing myself. There was no way around it. Roya's armor had fused permanently with his body, bone and metal grown together into one solid shell that couldn't be removed any more than you could peel the bark off a living tree. The monkeys and bone dogs technically didn't wear anything, but they weren't humanoid enough for the system to count, which left exactly one candidate in the entire territory with a human body and removable clothing: me. I ordered every creature to turn around. Roya positioned himself at the front like a black iron wall, blocking any possible line of sight. The monkeys, bone dogs, and clawballs all rotated obediently, facing outward toward the darkness. Then I stripped down next to the third field and stood there in the freezing wind for 10 minutes while the cold cut through me like knives, and whatever remained of my dignity curled up and died, somewhere in the back of my mind. When it was over and the third leaf finally dropped, I got dressed as fast as humanly possible, pulled the fur coat tight around my shoulders, and swore under my breath. The things I did for territorial development. Between the children's gymnastics routine and now this, the field's leaf requirements were clearly designed by something with a twisted sense of humor and zero respect for personal boundaries. If the next planting asked me to sing a love ballad while standing on one foot, I wouldn't even be surprised. The night's harvest operation was running beautifully by this point. My territory had transformed into something I'd started calling the slaughterhouse, not out of cruelty, but because that's exactly what it was. A processing facility where raw materials walked in and refined products came out. For monkeys stationed at the cardinal points of the perimeter, reaching into the darkness and pulling creatures in like fishermen working a river. Clawballs rolling continuous patrol loops along the inner edge, shredding anything that slipped through. Bone dogs sprinting back and forth hauling corpses to the processing area. Me and Roya crouching by the altar, splitting skulls and extracting crystals with the practiced rhythm of factory workers on a production line. The crystal count climbed steadily through the night. By midnight, my pouch held 97 fragments, approaching the equivalent of 12 full first-rank crystals. The territory floor was covered in bodies stacked like cordwood, black blood pooling between them and running downhill in slow rivulets. The smell was beyond description. A month ago, sitting in my comfortable room at the Golden Wheat Estate, this scene would have made me physically ill. Now I breathed it in and felt reassured. The stench of dead monsters was the smell of wealth, security, and progress. Every corpse was a deposit in the bank of my survival. Then the first field erupted. The soil heaved upward and split open, and something massive clawed its way out of the earth. It was the first-rank crawling eerie-eyed planted, the peak-level monster that had nearly killed me 2 nights ago, now reborn through the field's transformation. 20 extra corpses fed into it as fertilizer. A war poem recited over its growing body, matured during the eternal night for the darkness bonus. Every advantage I could stack had been stacked, and the result was terrifying. The creature that stood in my territory was larger and more heavily armored than the original. Black-red membrane skin stretched tight over dense muscle, with rows of blade-like bone plates running from the crown of its skull all the way down its spine to the tip of its tail. The joints bristled with curved bone spurs that would shred anything that got too close. But the most striking feature was the front claws, each one nearly a meter long, wrapped in faint wisps of dark energy, sharp enough to split stone. Its eyes burned crimson, but unlike the wild, chaotic hunger of its previous life, this gaze held a controlled ferocity, domesticated violence. It knew exactly what it was and who it belonged to. The moment it fully emerged, something shifted across the entire territory. Every one of my zero-rank creatures suddenly moved faster and hit harder, as if someone had injected them with adrenaline. The monkeys pulled with more force, the clawballs spun quicker, the bone dogs ran with sharper urgency. I checked the panel and understood why. The creature had hatched with a passive ability called Strong Eerie Aura. Any zero-rank creature within range got a 15% combat boost, and same-rank creatures got 5%. It was a walking buff zone, a field commander that made everything around it more dangerous just by existing. Combat value, 376. Not as high as Roy's 498, but absolutely devastating against anything at 0 rank. I pointed it toward the northern perimeter and told it to test its claws. It crossed the territory in 3 strides and positioned itself at the light-dark boundary, front half inside the protection zone, massive claws extending into the blackness. 1 horizontal sweep and 3 crawling eerie's outside the perimeter were bisected instantly. A second slash took a bone dog's head clean off. The creatures in the darkness actually retreated from it, creating a visible gap in the wall of shadows, a vacuum of fear that lasted several seconds before new monsters pushed forward to fill the space. Everything was working. The production line hummed. The crystal count rose. The army grew stronger. For the first time, my territory felt like a real domain rather than a campfire I was desperately trying to keep lit. I had walls of teeth and claws instead of stone, soldiers made of darkness instead of trained men, and a skeleton knight on a bone horse who could delete anything that got too ambitious. Eternal Territory was becoming exactly what its name promised, something built to last. Then the north side exploded into chaos. A flash of crimson light from deep in the darkness, not the scattered, unfocused glow of random eerie's, but a deliberate, intelligent pulse. Before I could process what I'd seen, something whipped out of the blackness faster than anything I'd encountered. A thick, dark tendril, like a vine made of raw meat, shot across the boundary and wrapped around one of my monkeys before it could even raise its arms to defend itself. The monkey was yanked out of the light circle and into the darkness in less than a second. Gone. No scream, no struggle. Just there one moment, and swallowed by the night the next. Like a fish being pulled underwater by something lurking in the deep. I shouted for everyone to pull back from the edges. The order was still leaving my mouth when a second tendril lashed out from the same direction, and this time it went for my first-rank eerie. The fleshy vine coiled around its neck and front legs with crushing force and hauled backward. The eerie reacted instantly. 1 claw flashed and severed the tendril clean through. But the momentum was already carrying it forward, and the massive creature slid across the dirt and over the boundary, disappearing into the darkness beyond my fire's reach. My heart nearly stopped. 376 combat value, just pulled out of my territory like a toy being snatched by a bully. I could hear it through our mental link. Not words, but sensations. Rage. Pain. The sound of dozens of zero-rank creatures swarming it from every direction, biting and clawing at the gaps in its bone armor. Even a first-rank creature couldn't survive indefinitely against an unlimited swarm in total darkness, especially with an unknown attacker controlling meat tendrils from somewhere deeper in the shadows. I made 3 rapid decisions. The clawballs would charge out and cut a path. Roya would anchor himself at the boundary and provide cover. Nobody was to leave the territory's protection zone entirely. The unknown creature with the tendrils was too dangerous to chase blind. The 2 remaining clawballs launched themselves into the darkness like spinning saw blades, their dozens of protruding claws chewing through everything in their path. Zero-rank Eries simply couldn't stop them. The blades carved through flesh and bone with equal ease, opening a corridor of carnage toward where I could feel my first-rank Eerie fighting for its life. Roya mounted his bone horse and positioned himself right at the edge of the light, half in and half out. His sword swept in controlled arcs, the death energy extending his reach well beyond the physical blade, cutting down anything that tried to flood through the gap the clawballs had opened. He was a gatekeeper, keeping the path clear for the rescue while preventing the darkness from pouring into the territory through the breach. A tendril snaked out of the darkness toward him. Roya didn't flinch. Black radiance, horizontal slash. The black crescent of energy screamed through the air and severed the tendril into multiple pieces. The slash kept going, clearing out a wide swath of zero-rank creatures and continuing deep into the darkness where it hit something that shrieked. A high, piercing sound that was nothing like the mindless hissing of common Eries. That was an intelligent scream. A pain response from something that had expected to hunt without consequence and was just reminded that consequences existed. Roya reached into the darkness with his free hand, grabbed the bone plate on my first-rank Erie's back, and hauled it bodily back into the light circle. The massive creature hit the ground hard, covered in wounds, dozens of shallow cuts, and bite marks packed into every gap between its armor plates. It was alive, furious, and already healing the moment Roya tossed a corpse within reach of its jaws. 2 of the 3 clawballs made it back. The 3rd didn't. Somewhere in the darkness, a ball of blades and flesh had been overwhelmed by sheer numbers and torn apart. Another soldier lost to the night. I crouched beside my wounded first-rank Eerie and pushed a fresh corpse toward its mouth. It bit down and started feeding, wounds already beginning to close as the dark energy from the dead flesh flowed into its body. I watched the regeneration process while my mind worked through what had just happened. Something new was out there. Not a standard Eerie, something that used organic tendrils as weapons, that could strike from a distance and drag prey into the darkness, that was smart enough to target my highest value unit specifically. It had gone for the monkey first, eliminating my harvesting capability, and then immediately tried to pull my strongest combat unit out of the light. That was tactical thinking. That was strategy. Whatever this creature was, it was observing my territory, identifying my key assets, and targeting them in order of importance. That terrified me more than raw power would have. I could build defenses against strength. I could grow creatures to match brute force. But fighting something that thought, that planned, that adapted to my tactics, that was a fundamentally different kind of threat. Roya confirmed that his slash had grazed the creature's main body but hadn't landed a killing blow. It was lurking somewhere in the darkness to the north, out of range but not gone. Wounded, maybe. Cautious, definitely. But it would be back. Things that hunted with that kind of intelligence didn't give up after one failed attempt. They adjusted and tried again. I set the monkeys back at the perimeter with strict orders to keep their arms closer and pull back at the first sign of movement from the north. The 2 surviving clawballs resumed their patrol. Roya stayed mounted, watching the northern darkness with those steady crimson eyes. The harvesting operation continued, but the carefree efficiency of the earlier hours was gone. Every shadow at the perimeter's edge now carried the possibility of a tendril strike. My creatures worked faster, but with visible tension. Even the mindless ones seemed to sense that something dangerous was watching from out there. I stood by the altar, counting crystals and planning. The tendril creature would come back. When it did, I wanted to be ready. Not just to defend, but to kill it, drag its body inside, and plant it in a field. Whatever grew from something that smart and that dangerous would be worth every risk. The night was far from over, and the darkness had just proven it still had surprises left. But so did I. My territory was growing, my army was healing, and somewhere in the black soil of my fields, new soldiers were already taking shape. The slaughterhouse would keep running. The crystals would keep flowing. And the next time that thing in the north reached for one of mine, I'd be ready to take its arm off and grow something beautiful from the stump. During the eternal night, I kept watching the darkness to the north. My monkey corpse monsters kept pulling weak monsters into my territory, where we killed them one after another. The meat vine monster never attacked again. Maybe Roya's sword hurt it, or maybe it was afraid of him. I thought it was too scared to fight. When the eternal night finally ended, daylight came all at once. Every monster outside disappeared, leaving only broken bodies behind. I was happy because I had survived another day. There were monster corpses everywhere, so Roya and I started collecting crystal fragments from them. We found 206 crystal fragments, which was a huge reward. I felt like the eternal night was not just dangerous, it was also a great place to gather resources. I ordered my monsters to store the useful bodies, eat the rest, or absorb their dark energy to become stronger. I used 16 crystal fragments to keep my territory running for another day. A new mutated monkey corpse monster grew from my cursed field. Then I put 96 crystal fragments into the field to help it grow. Now it can produce the equivalent of about 15 crystal fragments every day, which will slowly make my territory richer. After that, I had to eat my terrible black bread and smoked meat. It tasted awful, but it kept me alive. Once I finished eating, I sent my strongest monsters out to hunt across the plain. I told them to return before sunset. I kept one monkey monster behind to work in the territory, while Roya stayed to guard everything. I was exhausted, so I went to sleep in my tent. Roya never rested. He stood beside the territory fire like a loyal knight, protecting my land. When I woke up later, the air was much colder. Winter was coming, and I realized I had already survived 5 nights in this dangerous world.